So thanks everyone for being here. I know we're a little bit late. As you probably heard, the U.S. government shutdown has been temporarily resolved, and so we have travel plans of various people that we thought didn't know if they'd be here, and so we spent a little time on looking at how to potentially shift the agenda around. So I'm going to ask Dr. Wilson to go over what might be a few small changes to accommodate these new travel plans.
Thank you, Chair. So first of all, you will recall that yesterday afternoon we deferred the public comment on yesterday's presentations to this morning. And so for the next 30 minutes, we will be holding that public comment period. We do have a number of individuals who have already signed up, and if you, throughout the course of this half hour, if you would like to add your name to the laptop, which is at the podium at the back of the room, and that will automatically be passed up to the Secretariat to ensure that you are able to come up and make your presentation. Please do limit your interventions to a few minutes, and when your name is called, please just come to the front podium to make your intervention. As the Chair has indicated, we'll then make a couple of rearrangements to the schedule. Once we'll go through the MSE components, which is Agenda Item 7, so the Management Strategy Evaluation components. We have three presentations, one by Dr. Hicks as an update to the Management Strategy Evaluation process, then by one of the co-chairs, Mr. Adam Kaiser, who will present the MSAB reports for 2017. And then we have Agenda Item 7.3, which will be a discussion of the goals and objectives of the MSE process. At that point, we are going to have a change in the schedule. Dr. Sean Cox, who is the chair of the Scientific Review Board, we will move his presentation, which was previously scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, and that will move up to immediately following those MSE proposals. Depending on where we are in relation to the break, we'll then have a public comment period again on those three MSE elements, including the MSAB process and also the Scientific Review Board. So throughout those effectively 4 presentations, if you would like to comment on the MSE or MSAB process, please once again sign up on the laptop at the back of the room. The rest of the morning will be filled with the presentation of regulatory proposals. We do have 3 proposals from the contracting parties, all from NOAA Fisheries, and noting that the Chair has pointed out that the presenters of those proposals will be coming in at some point today. We're going to move the presentation of those 3 regulatory proposals to tomorrow. Now, we're well aware that the Conference Board and the Processor Advisory Board will be meeting at that time, and as such, we're going to ask the presenter work with the chairs of both of those bodies to ensure that those 3 regulatory proposals are presented directly to the boards as per or as your schedule permits. That should take us out for most of today or the rest of today. At some point, we will start the agency reports, again, noting that some of the agency staff won't be arriving or won't be able to present until tomorrow, but we do have all of tomorrow's session also assigned for the presentation of agency reports, and so we'll make up any lost time there. And then finally, a reminder of the IPHC function this evening, and we'll give you more specifics of that event location, or reminders rather, throughout the day. With that, I'll pass back to the Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll also note, and probably everyone has picked this up, this year, for the first time that I recall, we are going to have some final decisions made not on Friday morning. So on Thursday afternoon, you will note on the agenda that we will talk about regulatory proposals. That's where those decisions will be made. The long-timers here will know that we've always done all of the motions on Friday morning. It's a slight change. I don't think it'll affect anyone, but just thought, call it to your attention. So with that, let's see if we have some public comments on all of the reports from yesterday, including the stock assessment.
Yes, thank you, Chair. There are 2 people signed up already, and I'm sure there may be more as we go along, but the first speaker is Paul Clampett.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Paul Clampett, the owner of the fishing vessel Augustine. Looking in the material, I noticed that if you encounter whales at a survey station, the data is determined to be usable if the whales are are inside 100 meters, and there is no more than 10% damage to the catch or gear. The whales, in particular killer whales, are now prevalent west of Kodiak, and if you encounter killer whales, it is my contention that the data at the survey station is unusable. If you see killer whales even outside 100 meters, you are more likely than not to being subject to depredation. These animals strip your gear of everything and leave no trace. I don't know how they do it, but they do. Anyone who has fished in these areas has experienced it. If Dr. Stewart and Dr. Webster haven't been on a survey in these areas, I think they should experience it. It's the only way they'll understand what they're really dealing with there. Yesterday, Dr. Stewart said that recruitment data was mainly derived from these long-range surveys, and if that's true, we are underestimating recruitment. I also want to mention that I think the 16% exploitation rate in 3B West is arbitrary and should be raised to 21% as in other areas. The quota holders in 3B are being asked to take a nearly 40% cut while using a 16% exploitation rate, and I think that's draconian. I also think that the survey data from Area 2A should be thrown out because of the anoxic conditions at the time of the survey, and we should go back to last year's quota, at least. In conclusion, I believe we have a serious problem with our long-line surveys, particularly in the light of the fact that we continue to use data collected in the presence of whales. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Bob, please.
So, Paul, I have a question. In the 2016 report to the of the IPHC, there's a comment that on whale deportation that the scientists are on the surveys are looking for if 10% of the hooks are damaged or something like that. Is that a reasonable matrix or metric to look at in terms of whale deportation, or is it are they more stealth than that?
Well, in my experience, that may be reasonable in the presence of sperm whales with halibut. With halibut and killer whales, I don't think that's reasonable. I think you can talk to pretty much every fisherman here, and it's experienced having extremely good halibut fishing in those areas, and then the whales show up and you have nothing. They're not even lips on the hooks, and they don't seem to straighten the hooks out either. They have a method of cleaning them off like a grape on a vine.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I didn't hear a question, so we'll certainly talk about this with our assessment people, but thanks for the comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next speaker is Malcolm Milne.
Good morning. Excuse me. Good morning. My name is Malcolm Milne. I'm from Homer, Alaska. And thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners, for allowing us to give some public comment this morning. And I also want to thank Dr. Stewart for giving a great presentation yesterday. You always do a good job of changing it a little bit and taking questions. And but the one question I did have was something that Commissioner Bankin had alluded to, and that was the risk table that was associated with last year's adopted catch. I looked at some of the reports from last year and saw a partial risk table and was hoping if you would be able to provide the full risk table for that.
Thanks, Malcolm, and good morning. If I could have my extra slides. Okay, so as Malcolm noted, our report from the 2017 annual meeting included only a partial decision table based on the adopted catch limits, only the stock trend and stock status blocks of this table. So I provide here for your reference and for the record the full table based on last year's annual meeting, and what I've highlighted here is the adopted catch limit put back into that table after the meeting. So you can see that the adopted catch limit corresponded to a projected total removals of 43.3 million pounds and an SPR, or an SPR value of 45%, so slightly more fishing intensity than what we were calling the status quo SPR, which is this year the reference line. And you'll note, following up on the question yesterday, that the probability of decline in spawning biomass in 2018 was estimated to be 71% in that case. I think the piece that was missing, the fishery trend block on the far right-hand side there, if you read the first entry there, that indicates that we estimated a 70% chance that there would be a decrease in the fishery CEY in 1 year, based on last year's adopted catch limits, and a 57% chance that that decline would be at least 10% based on the adopted catch limits last year. So again, this is just a follow-up to last year's meeting.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Stewart. Could I make a comment on that, Mr. Chair? Thank you. So, so I really appreciate this, and I was hoping to have that information, because that 57% chance of a greater than 10% change between 2017 and 2018 is, I mean, exactly what we're seeing now. So somehow, I don't even know how you come up with these numbers, but you seem to be accurate. And since we've done away with the staff recommendations, and we've now have moved away from a certain line that we had after that, our adopted catch levels have been consistently over that line. So I've been trying to use an ice hockey term for this, so we can put it in terms in respect for our Canadian counterparts here, but I'd say we're offsides. We've crossed this line to higher risks, and as the commissioners, I see you as the referees, so I'm hoping that you will blow the whistle on this being across this line, because in my opinion, accepting these higher risk levels are unacceptable. So I just hope that you guys take that into consideration. According to the tables, we're more likely to see a decline than not at this SPR level. So my other question was to Dr. Stewart again, and I don't know if you're the right person to ask this, but how did SPR 46 become the handrail or the interim management procedure? Because I still haven't quite understood why we're using SP 46 as a reference.
So I can address that question, thanks. Historically, the blue line was used as the point of reference in the decision table from 2012 through last year's process. And as you can see on this table, the two rows above the adopted catch limits indicate the comparison that we provided during last year's meeting of the blue line, which last year corresponded to F48%, and the status quo SPR, which was our estimate of the average SPR realized over the last 3 years at that time, and noting that that reflected the actual adopted catch limits in that period of time, 14, 15, and 16, and that it did correspond to a slightly higher level of fishing intensity. But the discussion then during last year's annual meeting was that since that's what had been occurring over the last, and it appeared to have roughly stabilized the stock over that time period, that it was an appropriate short-term reference level pending the results, the more detailed results coming from the management strategy evaluation process. And so that evolution from what was last year an F48 blue line to the Commission selecting the reference level of F46, slightly more fishing intensity, and then ultimately the adopted catch limits, which were just slightly more fishing intensity than the reference level.
Okay, thank you. Well, in my opinion, using the adopted levels as our reference point, I think, is too aggressive. So that's my opinion. I appreciate the time.
Thank you for the comment, Malcolm.
So, Mr. Chairman, we have no other sign-ups from in the room, and there are no questions online right now either. Yep.
Mr. Larson says there's an additional.
Yep, I beg your pardon. Let me refresh here. That was my error. I'm sorry. So the next speaker is Gary Williamson.
Hello, my name is Gary Williamson, the Canadian Sablefish Association. I'd like to talk about the bycatch in both the Gulf and in the Bering Sea. And Ian, you told us at our meeting in Vancouver that you were happy with some of the drop in the bycatch. And I've had trouble with that one because I read through your own statistics. The IPHC fishery statistics says Area 3 is the most poorly available information. The bycatch there is just a guess at best. In 2012, the North Pacific Council said exactly the same thing, only they put it, there was more areas that were having the same problem. So I can't figure out what made it go down this year. When you don't have more observers, you probably got less than you had before, and probably the fleet's gotten bigger. So I just can't get that in my head around that. Can you shed some light on it?
Yes, I can speak to that. I will note that the Commission will be receiving an agency report from the National Marine Fisheries Service, which I believe will address the bycatch estimates, among other topics. And in addition, I think there may be a specific presentation, and I'm not sure who's giving it, on the EFP program that has led to many of the bycatch reductions that we see in this year's data. I think you paraphrased some of our report, and I will re-paraphrase that in that our greatest uncertainty in bycatch in Alaska does lie in the Gulf of Alaska, particularly the trawl catcher vessels in the Western Gulf that tend to have lower observer coverage than in other areas. The large reductions that we've seen in the last couple of years, however, are coming primarily from much larger vessels, catcher processors in the Bering Sea, that do carry a much higher level of observer coverage, generally 100%, in some cases even 200%, with 2 observers trading off. So I think that while we definitely have important uncertainty associated with our bycatch estimates, particularly in the Gulf, that much of the reductions appear to be very real this year, that they are coming from fleets that have higher observer coverage, and they are largely a function of that deck sorting program, getting halibut back in the water in better condition, as observed by scientists on those boats, than they have in the past. But I will defer to the upcoming reports in this meeting for more detail on those topics.
So, but you don't have any number, like we had 100 observed trips last year. How many have we got this year? Any statistics like that?
I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but I believe that some of the agency people, when and if they are able to get to this meeting, will have more detail. I'm not sure what's already available in the reports that they've submitted, the written reports that they've submitted.
Okay, so thanks very much, Ian. I think that's correct. We will have agency people here. They would have been here already, save for the government shutdown, but we will have from the Amendment 80 fleet, the deck sorting project that Dr. Stewart referred to. We'll have a report on that tomorrow morning, and we'll have agency reports, which will include observer information when they get here. Thank you.
And next up is Wilf Phillips.
I just wanted to make sure that you guys are taking into account what we know is something in 40 years of halibut fishing I've never seen is the pyrosomes that were out there, and it was right at the same time your survey was going on. I've never seen such terrible fishing. I just talked to my brother this morning. He's out black cod fishing right now. And they're seeing that last year at the same exact time they saw none of them. And right now they're coming up on the tops of the traps and they're seeing the most halibut that he's ever seen. So is that taken into account in any of your survey?
So Ian might answer that, but Mr. Phillips, can you tell us where you're from?
Canada, PHMA.
So I can speak to that. I mentioned the influx of gelatinous zooplankton, or as you've correctly identified them as pyrosomes, has been observed not just in the Gulf of Alaska, but up through Washington, British Columbia, perhaps Oregon as well. These are generally a subtropical species of zooplankton that's, I think, not been previously observed in these numbers up into northern waters. And I will note that not just the IPHC survey, but also the trawl surveys saw them in very great numbers. In fact, they identified them in stomach contents of a number of important fish, including rockfish and sablefish. I'm not sure whether there were actually any found in the stomach contents of halibut, but they're definitely on everybody's list of concerns. Unfortunately, nobody that I've talked to, including many of the people that do ecosystem research at the Alaska Center and in other places, nobody's really sure what to make of these pyrosomes yet. We did see them particularly on our survey. At this point, we're not doing any quantitative corrections to account for their presence, but they're a concerning new development in the ecosystem of the Gulf and the Northeast Pacific.
Well, I did the numbers, and it looks like our fishing was roughly 25% of the worst we've ever done in all the same exact spots through that whole period, what they were doing their surveys. So it should have had some effect on the numbers that they were catching as well.
I will note that our temperature data suggests that the temperatures have cooled off in 2017 relative to what they were from 2014, 15, and 16. And given the temperature tolerance of that particular creature, I think there is some hope that we will see them decrease now that the water's cooled back off, although I have not heard any reports from later this fall to hear what the current status is in terms of observations other than yours.
Yeah, well, that's as of this morning. He's out there seeing 10 times what they saw last year at the very worst, and that's at 300 fathoms plus. So we can expect something. That's all.
Thank you for the comment. Mr. Keith?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The next speaker is Chuck Ashcroft.
Yes, thank you very much for listening to this. My name is Chuck Ashcroft, Sport Fishing Advisory Board in Canada, and I have a few questions. Should be simple answers, not just for Ian as well, but for Ian maybe. Do you have an average size of the trawl caught bycatch of halibut, like that in length? I've tried to find the documentation on the actual sizes. That's more or less a mean or average size that's caught, if that's possible.
I'm reluctant to give you a specific number off the top of my head. We do have those numbers. It varies by target fishery and by source and by location, but generally somewhere in the 4 to 6 pound range is what we've seen in the last few years for an average trawl caught halibut. But it very much depends on which regulatory area you're in. That would be a Bering Sea fish. As you move down the coast, particularly into Area 2, the average size of a trawl caught fish goes up substantially.
Yeah, and that is another question. I appreciate that, and our concern, of course, is the Gulf of Alaska and Bering Sea. So I'll use that as a base. Regarding the, I noticed in a notation in the RERA on page 137 on the survey vessel, the Ocean Explorer, and it noted that 20% of the females caught in the survey were mature instead of about 20%, instead of 10%. Now, if would the survey actually be a semi-proxy for the fisheries that take place in the trawl, so that basically it's saying that there could be 20% of the females caught in the groundfish fisheries could be mature females, and is that an issue? Or is it a reflection of the fact there's fewer small fish as estimated now?
I'm sure there are certainly mature females caught incidentally in other fisheries, in other trawl fisheries. By and large, the age distribution of fish in the trawl surveys and coming from bycatch sources of mortality tend to peak around ages 3 through 6. That tends to be the most common age, and it tapers off fairly rapidly after that. We think that the larger halibut, particularly for the surveys, are able to outrun that gear. So they may be, even if they're in front of the net, they may actually be able to move out of the way. We tend to see a lower fraction of very large fish caught with trawl gear than we would expect to see on long lines. So that said, the fish, we understand halibut to mature, roughly 50% are mature females between 11 and 12 years old. So that would suggest a relatively small fraction. I don't know whether 10% would be exactly consistent with that, but it sounds possible given what I've seen in the age distribution.
Yeah, it's just mentioned in the RARA, and it did stand out that it was a doubling of the number of females that are mature. And that's where I thought, well, maybe that's part of an issue that we're dealing with lower productivity. But anyhow, I appreciate that. My other question was, well, more or less a clarification or maybe a question as where the data came on the recreational fishery for Area 12, or Area 2B, and it's on slide 12 in the presentation. And where we're advised that we're 10% over on the recreational allocation, and Commissioner Bacon noted that as well. And so I have to respond. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans report that will be going to the commissioners later today or tomorrow indicates that we're only 19,000 pounds over. Our allocation was 1.18, and our catch was 1.137, and we were closed off on September 6th. So I don't know how the 1.06 allocation and our catch of 1.17, how that was factored, because those numbers do not seem to jive with what we have for Canadian figures and for what you'll be discussing here later in your own session. So that's all I really had to say. Thank you.
We'll see if we can double check those figures, but thanks very much for your comment. Mr. Keith?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next speaker is Russell Cameron.
Yeah, good morning. Russell Cameron, Canadian commercial fisherman and U.S.A. WU representative, the union. I guess I wanted to come up and say something because I like the assessment coast-wide that made sense to, I think, what's going on, and that we do have a recruitment problem coming, and that there is that. But then, as with the last, since Ian's been here, and the retrospective have been fixed, and then the apportionment way that it comes down to be for 2012 to 2017, as everybody here knows, the apportionment estimates of catch has been around 5 million pound in 2B, under 5 and over 4 in that period, and that just doesn't make any sense to what we're seeing on the ground in any of those years. And now in this year, it's 3.84, I think, is what the apportionment is showing, which it doesn't make sense. And I remember Ian saying early that what your modeling and what your science should do should make sense of what you're actually seeing, the commercial fleet, at least for us, is seeing, and the catch rates and things. And so I just want to reiterate that whereas I think the overall stocks and that the science is good there, we haven't, the apportionment or stock distribution or whatever is still a really problem when it comes to Area 2. And so And this year in particular, it just seems crazy. But the other half of that is, I think the system works because by the time we've come out of the meeting, we've had catches that have been reasonable to what catch limits. And so I'm hopeful that this year as well, the system will work and that somewhere along the line, the stock distribution will get better figured out. Yeah.
Thank you for the comment. Response to you, or it's not really a question, I guess, but okay, thank you very much. Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's the end of the speakers list from the floor, and there are no questions online either.
All right, thank you very much. That will end this particular public comment period. These comments, even though we don't respond fully all of the time, are very important to us, and they all register, so we appreciate the extra effort it takes to get up to the microphone and give us your thoughts. So thanks. With that, shall we? When do they start? No? They'll start tomorrow. This afternoon. So that was our end of our deliberations at this point on the catch tables, and so tomorrow when the conference board and the PAG start, we'll expect that you're using table 3 of the paper revision, paper 11 revision 1. So there are, Ian's presentation had a number of catch tables, but that would be the focus point for the PAG and the conference board tomorrow. And if that's not clear, we can talk to Ian or us later on. So with that, I think we can start the MSAB reports. MSC, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. And so I'd like to invite Dr. Hicks to present an update on the management strategy evaluation process, starting with paper 12.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody here. I'm Alan Hicks, IPHC staff for about a year and a half now. And I want to present to you a quick update on our management strategy evaluation process that we've been going through at the Commission. So before I start, I just want a brief description and definition of what management strategy evaluation is. And that is, it's a process to evaluate a harvest strategy policy and develop a management procedure that's robust to uncertainty. And that robust to uncertainty is a real key of that definition. So why might we do MSE, you may be asking me? And that's to develop a harvest strategy that provides a long-term sustainable fishery and determine a reference level for fishing intensity. There was already a question about why do we have an SPR 46%? Well, that's a question that I'm trying to answer in this MSE process. And then to understand the trade-offs of different management procedures and components of a harvest rule, that'll become more clear as I give this presentation, but there's a lot of trade-offs here, trade-offs between biological sustainability and fishery yield, for example. We'll talk about some of those trade-offs. But MSE is a process. It's not a quick analysis that we do. It's a real process that engages stakeholders and managers. And we have a management strategy advisory board. We're working with that board to develop the MSE, and they're actually a big part of this process. In fact, it's driven by these stakeholders and managers on that board. And that process can begin with defining fishery objectives. I'll talk more about objectives shortly. And then we develop management procedures. And that's how we actually determine what catch levels may be and the distribution of the TCEY. Then I go away, do a lot of work on simulation and running my models, and then I bring that back to the board, the stakeholders and managers involved in the process, and we evaluate the results. And we may actually backtrack to some of these boxes over time. We may learn things as we walk through this process, but eventually the goal is to apply a rule or a procedure, a harvest strategy policy that we would then use in this process to determine catch levels by regulatory area. But that's not the end of the process. We're always learning. So remember, this is a process, it's circular, and communication is a real key to this. So starting with the objectives, the Management Strategy Advisory Board has defined 6 sort of overarching goals of the fishery, the management of the fishery. And those include biological sustainability, fishery sustainability, access and stability, minimizing discard mortality, minimizing bycatch and bycatch mortality, serving consumer needs, and preserving biocomplexity. We'll actually talk a bit more about these in agenda item 7.3 later this morning. The management procedure, that's part of the harvest strategy policy. And what I have here is a figure showing the harvest strategy policy, and the left 2 boxes are the procedure. And this is a procedure that we're currently operating under. So there's different colors and shapes of boxes here, and those are different inputs and outputs. And so, for example, starting on the left side of this plot or figure, we have a scale component, and that's this coast-wide component of the stock assessment. How do we determine how much halibut we want to remove from the stock on a coast-wide basis? And that's the overall scale. Ian provides us, Dr. Stewart provides us with a coast-wide assessment, and that feeds into a decision table that's then brought forward here at the annual meeting for everybody to evaluate. But we have this reference fishing intensity, and that's the SPR 46% right now. And that determines the total mortality on a coast-wide level, which is then split into an O26 TCY component and a U26, or under 26-inch component. Now that's a coast-wide TCY, and that needs to feed into how do we distribute that to the regulatory areas. And we have a component called stock distribution, which I'll define in more detail later, and then other procedures. And so, for example, right now we're distributing the stock based on the results of the survey, what proportion we observe in each regulatory area from the survey. And then the distribution procedures that we're operating under right now are really only harvesting at a higher rate in the east compared to the west. So basically that's the procedure, and that procedure results in catch levels by, and that's the catch table that Dr. Stewart has presented to us earlier, or I guess yesterday. And then that feeds all through the different boards here at the annual meeting and the commission to come up with regulatory area catch limits. So let's dial into some of these components and some of the results. First, a reminder what spawning potential ratio is. We're going to be talking a lot about SPR. We've already talked about it a lot. And it's basically the spawning output per recruit with fishing divided by the spawning output per recruit with no fishing. So it's a measure of how much effect is fishing having on spawning output. And this is a long-term equilibrium average concept. So it's not a concept of what the fishing intensity today and of how it affects tomorrow, but it's if we fished at this fishing intensity at that same level for many years, what would the reduction in spawning potential be on average? So you think about this, an SPR 100% means no fishing. Fishing intensity is very low at an SPR 100%, but at SPR 40% means there'd be a 60% reduction in the spawning potential. And this is what Dr. Stewart and myself have been referring to as coast-wide fishing intensity. So fishing intensity is determined from what's called a harvest control rule. And that's part of the management procedure. And different components of this harvest control rule are what we are investigating in this management strategy evaluation process. So on this figure here, we have SPR on the left axis, that vertical axis. And you can see that actually SPR is 0% at the top, because that's a very high fishing intensity, and SPR 100% is at the bottom, because that's a very low fishing intensity. This line is, the SPR is a function of stock status, which is the horizontal or x-axis at the bottom there, and stock status is a measure of how much the stock may have been depleted. And so you see we have a procedural or maximum fishing intensity by that higher horizontal line. And once we hit a trigger point where stock status gets below some level, we start reducing the fishing intensity as a protective measure on the stock. And then once it hits a limit, we actually cut off the fishing, and the fishing intensity goes to nearly zero at that point. So what we're actually going to investigate, I'll show you results of today, are the blue aspects of this harvest control rule. and that is the procedural SPR. So what is this reference level of SPR that we should be operating under? What should we expect the behavior or the results to look like? And then that trigger, should that trigger be around 30% stock status, 40% stock status, or something else perhaps? So I've investigated ranges of SPR from 25% to 60%, of which 46 is included in that range, and then trigger values of 30% or 40%, where 30% is the current trigger value we're operating under. And you may have heard it called the 30-20 control rule, where 20 would be the limit. So that's the management procedure that I'll show you results for, but I had to go away and do a little bit of simulation over the summer. And this is a quick example or a framework of the simulation model that I'm using. On the left-hand side, you can see an operating model, which can the population dynamics and some of the fishery dynamics, but these are things that we cannot or choose not to control. We really can't control, say, the environment and its effect on recruitment, for example. The population simulation is output into the management procedure, and that management procedure are things that we can control, things that we actually want to test and evaluate. For example, monitoring. How do we collect data? How much data? Where do we collect data from? The estimation model. How is the assessment model done? And then finally, the harvest rule, which consists of that harvest control rule I showed earlier, size limits, distribution of harvest, and all those other aspects that's determining how the removals of halibut should occur. This is done simulated on an annual process, so I simulate an annual process of this, where this management procedure feeds back into the simulated population and then outputs again the next year into this management procedure. So it's trying to simulate the actual process of management that occurs. I want to note in the results that I'll present to you today, I do not address these first two aspects of the management procedure, so there's no estimation model, but it's really trying to drill into the effect and the evaluation of the harvest rule. And specifically those two aspects, the maximum or procedural SPR, and then that trigger where that ramp occurs on that control rule. So I'll show you some results, and these are equilibrium results or long-term equilibrium results, but I'm not trying to predict what's going to happen in 100 years, per se. I don't know that, and I don't claim that I ever will know that. Instead, I'm evaluating a management procedure and how it may behave given the uncertainty that we may expect to happen in the long term. So you can think about this as a long-term strategy. You know, on the long term, how do we want to manage the halibut stock? If we want to look at short-term strategies, the assessment is a much better tool for that. It's using current data. It's really trying to predict what's going to happen in the next few years. And we can use the assessment to actually evaluate the short-term tactical decision-making of a different management procedure. So I'll present to you 4 metrics. The dynamic relative spawning biomass is stock status, basically, and that's related to biological sustainability. And then total mortality, or fishery yield, is removal from all sources. And then AAV is the average annual variability. And you can think of that as fishery stability, stability in the quotas or the catch levels. And you can interpret it as the percent change you would see on average from year to year. So would you like to see a 6% change in the quota from year to year on average, or potentially a 15%? And then finally, the last metric is more informational, and that's the relative SPR. As I showed in that harvest control rule, sometimes the SPRs ramp down, or the fishing intensities ramp down, which changes the SPR that you're operating under. And so I want to compare the actual SPR to the procedural SPR. So these are plots that I've created to show you results, and I'll show those 4 different metrics on 4 different plots. So first we have stock status. On the leftmost axis, that vertical axis, is the stock status or percentage, dynamic RSB, relative spawning biomass. And then on the horizontal axis is the procedural SPR. And that's the SPR that we're inputting into that harvest control rule that we're operating under. For example, 46%. There's 2 different colored lines here. And the blue line is with a trigger point at 40%. So you're going to start ramping down fishing intensity sooner when stock status declines, as opposed to the black line, which is a trigger point at 30%. So we'd ramp down the fishing intensity at stock status 30% and below. And they both have a limit at 20%. And so we have on the horizontal axis on the right is a really low fishing intensity, and on the left is high fishing intensity, and the FI just stands for fishing intensity. So you can see if you move from the right to the left, as you would expect, the more we fish, the more the stock declines, and the more the stock status declines. But with that trigger point, the 30 or the 40%, you can see that the stock status begins to level off at higher fishing intensities or lower values of SPR. And so you see with a 40% trigger, that stock status levels off sooner than with a 30% trigger. Other things to note is on this plot, I have the vertical bars around those points, and that's the uncertainty that we would expect to see when operating under a consistent management procedure. So there's a lot of variability in the population. So the results would accordingly be variable. Even without fishing, there's a lot of variability. The stock status can go up and down depending on incoming recruitment. So, and other things you may notice is that as you fish harder, the variability around stock status actually decreases, and that's because we're taking that surplus production from the stock and translating that into mortality. So a similar plot for total mortality with the two different colors, and you notice the more you fish, moving right to left, the higher the total mortality, but that it begins to level off on average, and that's what the dots are indicating, so the average mortality that you would expect. But what you do notice, the harder you fish, the higher the fishing intensity, is the more variability you get around your total mortality, and you can translate that into the potential quota that you might get on a coast-wide basis. So you see the harder you fish, some years might be really high, but some years, just due to the conditions of the stock, might be very low. And then average annual variability. This might be of importance to a lot of people. Sort of stability year to year in those quota values. You know, do we want to see changes in 30% in the quota from year to year, or would we rather have that on average around less than 10%? And what we can see here is that operating under a consistent SPR around 40 to 60%, the average annual variability is on average about 6 to 8%. But it does have some range around it, sometimes as high as 15 to maybe even 18%. As we increase fishing intensity or get that SPR below 40% is when the variability in the catch levels vary quite greatly from year to year. And this is because now we're starting to go onto the ramp of that harvest control rule, where that fishing intensity is purposefully being reduced because we're now driving the stock right down to that trigger point. And we're hanging on that trigger point and flip-flopping between the ramp and that constant procedural SPR. And then finally, the realized SPR. Here, you can see there's a one-to-one line of the realized SPR on the vertical axis and the procedural SPR on the horizontal. And all this is showing is how often you are basically on the ramp. As you fish harder, you become more and more on the ramp, and the fishing intensity is reduced due to that harvest control rule. So you're actually operating under a different SPR than you would expect to having set a procedural SPR. So I basically walked through these summaries. I don't want to read this slide to you again, but I've included in the presentation in case you want a Word version of this. But there's trade-offs between these different metrics that I've shown you. Stock status declines, but fishery mortality is higher. The harder you fish, the more variable the quotas are from year to year. And so the job of the Management Strategy Advisory Board is to evaluate those trade-offs, and my job is to present them to them, and then come up with a management procedure that meets our objectives. And we'll talk about those objectives later this morning. So some conclusions when operating under a 30% trigger, which is what we're currently operating under. Stock status reductions are lessened at SPR values less than 40%. So the stock status tends to level off because of the ramp of that harvest control rule. Average total mortality increases very little at SPR values less than 40%. And the average annual variability shows a large increase at and below an SPR of 30%. So unfortunately, I did not do any simulations with SPRs between 30 and 40%. That's something I'll do this year. But it's looking like, you know, an SPR around 40% up into 50% is probably a good, reasonable range. And then there was direction from the interim meeting to look at some SPR values around 38%, I believe it was. And so remember, these are really best case results here because I did not have an estimation model in these simulations. I will be doing that in 2018, and the Management Strategy Advisory Board will be evaluating simulations that include that uncertainty also from estimation model. So that brings us back to the harvest strategy policy, where we just discussed looking at scale and that leftmost portion of this plot only, and that input fishing intensity. That translates into the total mortality and then a TCEY, which we then have to distribute across into the regulatory areas. And we've already heard some comment about that distribution. So we've examined scale. Now I want to talk about the distribution of the TCEY a little bit. There were some recommendations from the annual meeting last year, and that is basically noting the term apportionment has connotations broader than stock distribution. The Commission wanted it to be replaced with different terms, either stock distribution or stock distribution modeling. And you've seen that in my little figure. I've replaced that term and made it a little bit more clear what distribution actually means. The Commission also requested that the Secretariat initiate a process to develop alternative biologically based stock distribution strategies for consideration. And Dr. Stewart's actually presented part of this in terms of regions. And we believe that distributing to regions is more biologically based than trying to distribute the stock immediately down to regulatory area. We realize that it's important to distribute the TCEY down to regulatory area, but let's think about this first biologically before we get into the allocation step. So one example of a management procedure, and this is just one example, of how to distribute the TCEY, considering those factors of biologically based distribution and defining the term stock distribution, is to do this. We start with that coast-wide TCEY, that 026 component coming out of the scale part of the harvest strategy policy. And first we use the survey results by region, which Dr. Stewart has explained yesterday, and distribute the TCEY into those appropriate regions. And that's really a biologically based way to distribute the TCEY such that we may preserve biocomplexity. Once we distribute it to region, there still may be further adjustments across the different regions based on other factors, say trends in the survey, the size composition in each of the different regions. We may want to make further adjustments. And those would actually be defined procedures how to make those adjustments. There may be some adjustments, but eventually we really need to distribute to the regulatory areas. That's what's most important to you. And the quotas have to be defined by those regulatory areas. So we'd have some procedure defining how the region is then divided into each regulatory area within the region, and then there may be more procedures that are adjusting the TCEY between the different regulatory areas within a region. So again, these are all defined procedures that we're working on in the Management Strategy Advisory Board. They may use things like fishery WPUE or catch rates from the fishery, observations from size at age, observations of the size composition, etc. And these are things we're working on. But really the key here is we start with a coast-wide TCEY, we end up with catch levels by regulatory area, and the SPR is conserved across every single procedure. So there's the SPR that we input comes out at the end also. So on a coast-wide level, we're harvesting at the same fishing intensity after we distribute the stock to the regulatory areas. And that's a key here. So putting this all together, we have the scale, the TCEY distribution, distributing that out to the regulatory areas. That turns into a catch table that you guys have already seen, some catch tables at this meeting already. In accordance with the decision table, that all feeds into the different boards here at the annual meeting and through the commissioners and into the final decision of the regulatory area catch limits. And that's the harvest strategy policy, incorporating a defined procedure and then the annual process here at the decision-making level. So in conclusion, a few recommendations from the work that I've been doing already for the commissioners to consider: the simulation framework and results, recommend management procedures that may be of interest to evaluate, And we're always open to people's ideas, and that's really the stakeholder-driven process, is coming forward with your ideas how this procedure may operate. The commissioners could maybe agree whether clear separation of stock distribution and distribution procedures satisfies their recommendation number 38 from the annual meeting last year, and then potentially endorse the concept of distributing the TCY to biological regions as described here as a way to develop alternative biologically based stock distribution strategies. And thank you very much.
Nice presentation. Thank you, Dr. Hicks. Let's see if there's comments from the commissioners or questions. Commissioner Mencken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask you some questions that we were asked maybe yesterday in our meeting with stakeholders about these biological regions, and whether you or Ian or people on our scientific review board have considered the whether those, I mean, they feed into these management regions, Area 2, Area 3, Area 4, but a lot of people who fish have the sense that, say, 2C up to Yakutat, part of 3A, is more consistent than 2C is with 2A, for example, all the way down to California. And so if we are really walking down this path of here's how we're scientifically assigning the first step in this apportionment or distribution, whether that's really the most appropriate from a scientific basis.
Yes, that's a great question. And we would agree with you that perhaps these regions as they're defined, they're not the best definitions or the best boundaries to define biological regions per se. However, we're operating under the constraints of these regulatory areas that are already defined, and we have to eventually distribute the TCY into those different regulatory areas. So within that confinement of regulatory areas, the people before me have actually come up with these regions as the best way to possibly maintain those regulatory area lines and also define biological regions. So defining a line halfway in between 3A, up around Yakutat, is then going to make it difficult. How do you then take that region assignment and then further define it into regulatory areas? So right now we're operating under the confinements of the boundaries between regulatory areas, and that's the best that we could come up with.
Another question, but if other folks got one.
Thanks very much, Alan, for the presentation. I had a couple of questions and some comments that you may wish to respond to. But first off, I'd like to start with the idea that I fully endorse the work that the MSE is doing to better appreciate what we are doing around investigating fishing intensity. There's a lot of debate. We heard a question here this morning about whether SPR 46 was the appropriate level or not. And some concerns, I think, have been expressed both ways, that it's too aggressive of fishing intensity, and others expressing views that it's not enough. So, and the shape of that control rule that would go into it, whether it's 30 or 40%, be where one triggers the reduction. I think all those are things that really fit within the MSE work. And I think the other piece that I was going to raise too is around right now you're producing results on a long time frame, 100 years. And clearly there's an interest in seeing results, performance metrics produced on a shorter time frame. I'm not going to speculate what shorter means at this point, I guess, Alan, but I do think that there needs to be some more work on, and maybe looking at other MSE processes that have struggled with the same issue. I think there's a lot of social and economic reasons to look at shorter time frames. And I guess I know that there's a concern that by doing that, one might start thinking, well, if you look at short-term ones, you might be selecting things based on the biological reasons, meaning that that's a stock for I think really the whole purpose of an MSE is to look at management procedures and rank them based upon the objectives that everyone has agreed to. So I think there's still validity in looking at the short-term performance metrics as well as long-term ones. And I look forward to seeing the results for more work on how that can be defined for short-term ones within the MSE process. One of the areas that I really do struggle with, and you have your schematic showing, let's see, on slide 18, actually no, going further. On slide 23, and the schematics labeled a harvest strategy policy. And I guess, you know, I started off by saying, you know, around the fishing intensity and the harvest control rule that there will be a lot of guidance provided to the Commission about what's appropriate around SPRs or not as far as harvesting and how to implement that rule. One of the challenges I think that we have faced, and heard it, I think Russell came up to the microphone and spoke about challenges with how the resources allocated down to regulatory areas and disagreement with the rule that has been used in the past that apportions it into regulatory areas. In your middle of your diagram, you have TCE-Y distribution going down to regulatory areas. And I've seen quite a number of diagrams, and Ian's presentation yesterday had it down to regions, whether it be a region 2, 3, or 4. And it seems to me that I wonder if we really do have the information to get down to some algorithm based on science that will split out an allocation process. I think there's other things that go into developing allocations beyond just a simple science algorithm. I think it can provide a lot of guidance, but I think there are, again, I'll use the word social and economic considerations that go into how the resource will be allocated. So, well, I think the work that you and the MSE are doing to further conceptualize this into an overall harvest strategy policy is important to do and provide guidance to the Commission. I wonder how far one should go down. Right now, you have in here that's down to TCE-Y distribution to a regulatory area. I'm not sure whether that can be accomplished. I've heard that we only really have the science information to go down to regions, and so I guess that's one of my questions to you, Alan. And I guess that was a whole bunch of questions in there, so, and a number of comments.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'll try to address those. And first, thanks for your endorsement. That's good to know. The work is appreciated. In terms of the term, the length of time that I'm simulating out and reporting results on, I completely agree with you that short-term consequences are important to consider in this process as well. And so even if whatever long-term strategy we may decide on, we need to also understand the effects in the short term of that. So Dr. Stewart and I, along with the MSAB, are working really hard on providing them with the metrics they need to help evaluate the different strategies. So we're working on that, and would love any input anybody has. And then related to the last question, I think there are basically three there, with the TCY distribution, I think we're pretty much on the same page here. In terms of scientifically, we really don't feel that it's as useful to try and distribute the TCY into regulatory areas as maybe to biologically into regions. And part of that is, Dr. Stewart showed yesterday, estimating the proportion of the stock in each regulatory area introduces a lot more variability than estimating the proportion in the different regions. So it might actually introduce some stability going to regions. Plus, it's just biologically defined as well. But I do want to note, there on this figure shown on the screen, the black part is the stock distribution, and that's really the scientifically based part. That's the science input. When we get into the blue, I guess it's hexagons, that is parts, those are different procedures, and those procedures are not necessarily based on scientific products. Those could be allocation decisions, They could introduce, trends in different data sources. They could introduce just agreements between different areas. So there's opportunity in that blue section to introduce other concepts outside of the science. And then finally, the harvest strategy policy, I did not want to lose sight of the decision box on the right, because that is where even additional considerations might be taken into account. Current state of the stock, current economic conditions, and other things like that, where the commissioners may feel that they would want to further adjust that distribution for some reason behind the scenes.
Commissioner Benken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few comments, maybe questions, but I guess I would start by saying I definitely agree with Commissioner Ryall about the importance to the people participating in the MSAB process and stakeholders more generally, as well as commissioners, on looking at some shorter-term simulations, and that I know there's been a request for that, and that really will help to inform people's decisions on some of this really important work. I think I would say that in my mind, it seems too soon to endorse this distribution to these regions, even just based on the science. I think there's other objectives that we identified, and I think we're going to talk about them more today, but at our interim meeting, that could also, other ways this could be done that would also meet those objectives. And we heard some comments, I think it was from Russell today, about how there have been some counterintuitive results with the coastwide SPR between region 2, 3, and 4, based on the existing way of distributing, apportioning that harvest. And so that we may need to engage stakeholders a bit more in that process before we make that decision. But I guess in response to the last point made by Commissioner Ryall, and maybe you might have a comment on this, but I agree that we are not likely to get to regulatory area strictly based on biology, and that I understand is why you're calling that step a procedure, and that is where different considerations come in: social, economic, historic, dependence on an area, or commitments people have made to a certain area with their investments in quota share. But it seems to me that is also part of the job of the MSAB, and that's why we have those stakeholders there from all these regions, is to enter into some of those discussions and help guide us in developing those procedures. And I just wonder if that's an appropriate conclusion and what your thoughts might be on that.
Exactly, Commissioner Benken. That is why the Management Strategy Advisory Board is there, to guide me on what management procedures to evaluate. I can definitely help them come up with management procedures, but in the end, it's a stakeholder-driven process where I'm looking for their input on ways they find reasonable to do these different procedures, and then we evaluate the trade-offs of those, and we learn together in this process. So it is a stakeholder-driven process, and I think the Management Strategy Advisory Board has been working very well in coming up with a lot of ideas. It's worked really well in the scale of investigations already, evaluations, and I'm really looking forward to diving into this more. The discussions we've had already have been very useful. And if I may make a comment on the short-term statistics as well, I just want to note that I've given you some long-term results for different SPR values. Well, Dr. Stewart has presented short-term results for those different SPR values also. And that's one of the reasons why Dr. Stewart has reconfigured his decision table in the format into the format of what's commonly produced for a management strategy evaluation, with the procedures, the different procedures along the columns at the top, and then the different metrics along the rows on the left. And so now you have the opportunity to look at these MSE results and see the long-term behavior of these things, and then look at the short-term consequences over the next 3 years by just going right into that decision table.
More comments? Questions? We will have a public comment after the MS, there's 2 more papers in this session. So thank you very much, Dr. Hicks, and let's get Dr. Kaiser.
Loud enough there? Is that loud enough there? Yeah, okay, great. All right, morning everyone. My name is Adam Kaiser. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Management Strategy Advisory Board. I don't feel like I really have much to add given the comprehensive discussion we just had about this. But the objective of this report, this presentation, is to provide the 2 reports from the MSAB's meetings that occurred over the past year. So as I said, I'm one of the co-chairs. Rachel Baker is the other co-chair. She unfortunately isn't here with us today, but hopefully by the end of the week, Rachel will be able to participate along with her other colleagues. The MSAB, as I said, met twice over the past year to address the work plan that we had developed, but also to build on the existing work from the past few years, as well as the directions that we've received from the Commission. I mean, some of the highlights of the work that we've accomplished over the recent years is agreement on the previous harvest policy, references to the blue line being out of date, and that it likely did not meet the interim fishery objectives that the MSAB has started to discuss. We've also put forward a recommendation to move towards an SPR fishing intensity. That way it better accounts for mortality of all sizes. And so these recommendations have been brought forward for consideration, and that's in part why we're seeing FSPR values presented for scale this year and last. At the last meeting, we also received some direction from the Commission on, on providing some alternative processes for stock distribution. This was the last piece of discussion. And see what the MSAB can do to accelerate the MSE process. So to this end, the MSAB has made a number of requests and recommendations, both to ourselves but also to the Commission, regarding fishery objectives, the simulation framework that the MSE is occurring within, and then our program of work, what we're trying to accomplish and when. So the first recommendation around the fishery objectives was the MSAB agreeing to further revise goals, objectives, and performance metrics. As I think anyone who's participated in these meetings for the past number of years may recall, the MSE process is an iterative process. The objectives are not set once and left. We continue to revise and review the objectives as we get a better understanding of what our objectives really are and how management procedures perform against those objectives. So in Appendix 4 of our last report, we've detailed out what the proposed fishery objectives are, as well as the performance metrics related to those objectives. We're seeking some endorsement from the Commission. We want there to be opportunity for a fulsome discussion with Conference Board and PAB, et cetera, to talk about whether or not these objectives are appropriate. At a high level, the objectives, and granted these are actually probably more goals than objectives the way they're written, but at a high level, the MSAB has talked about objectives around biomass, maintaining some minimum level, and how quickly management procedures respond when the stock is estimated to be at those very low levels. At the MSAB, folks have talked about a range of performance metrics to understand these objectives. Some of them are be rather cerebral. It takes a bit to really wrap your mind around what's being talked about. Others are more concrete, more relatable to harvesters. You know, we want X number of mature females. There's also been a set of objectives proposed around maintaining fishing opportunity with different user groups, but also across the entire range of the stock. There's been a fair bit of discussion around not just maintaining fishing opportunity, but also how variable that fishing opportunity is. So again, while these 2 slides are pretty high level, really encourage folks to review the appendices of MSAB 10 report. It's on the Commission's website. Take some time to sit down, review them, digest it. It's not really something you can have just in a quick overview. The second objective, or second set of recommendations that the MSAB has put forward is a recommendation specifically on scale. Thinking back to Dr. Hicks's presentation, that black and blue and green figure, the harvest policy is separated into scale or fishing intensity and the distribution piece. The MSAB has spent most of its efforts over the past year, year and a half, focusing on scale. And the recommendation that came out of our last meeting was that target SPRs should probably fall within the range of 40 to 55%. While the MSAB had hoped to recommend a few specific values, not quite a range, the simulation framework needs some time to really allow us to evaluate where we're at. And so our recommendation was this range to at least narrow down the scope of work. The third objective, and this is probably the one where we really made the most progress, is to update our program of work so we know what's expected of ourselves and so that folks in this room know what's expected of the MSAB or what we're hoping to deliver over the next few years. The takeaways, well, sorry, here's the 3-year schedule. The takeaways, though, is that for the next annual meeting in 2019, the MSAB is proposing to have a recommendation on scale, a recommendation on an FSPR value that is best likely to meet the draft objectives that are outlined in Appendix 4. The hope is that then in 2021, at that annual meeting, we'd be able to put forward a recommendation both on scale, which may not be the same value as in 2019 as our understanding continues to change or grow, but also have a recommendation in 2021 on what the distribution would be. This is in respect to the Commissioner's direction from the annual meeting last year about developing alternative biologically based methods to distribute the stock. The reason the MSAB put forward the schedule in this way, this recommendation, is well, it's for a couple of reasons. It was a difficult discussion for folks, and I appreciate for some folks in the room that this time frame may seem too far off. The reason the MSAB is recommending scale first and then scale and distribution later is we really value the momentum that we've been gaining over the past few meetings in particular. Although an MSE, as Dr. Hicks has mentioned, is not a product where you just deliver something, it's a process of building agreement amongst quite a diverse range of perspectives. You still need something to keep you going. And I think we were quite successful in our past year's meetings in terms of gaining some momentum and folks gaining understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. And so to this end, maintaining momentum by getting a firm recommendation on scale, I think is very important for the process. Also, focusing on scale allows the Secretariat to continue to use the coast-wide model, while the MSAB and others in the room can consider how the spatial distribution piece is going to play out. We've heard that there's still more discussion to be had about how we're going to deal with distributing TCEY. So rather than have the MSAB and the Secretariat go away and develop something only to have it start over, let's focus on what we can get accomplished now. So a quick recap of the recommendations from this past year. One is proposing this draft set of fishery objectives, and we're recommending that the Commission review and provide some guidance on these objectives. Some preliminary discussion happened at the interim meeting. We look forward to further discussion today and throughout Conference Board and PAB over this coming week. The MSAB has recommended a range of FSPR values to hopefully focus some of the efforts of the Secretariat on the closed-loop simulations, on the evaluations. And the MSAB has recommended a program of work for the next 3 years. In addition to our recommendations, a few requests that we thought were of note for folks here were around our discussions of the work plan, around performance metrics, and around the simulation framework. Most of these requests were kind of internal to the MSAB or to the Secretariat to help guide our work, but 2 points that are worth flagging here was around the time periods for evaluation. I flagged that because there was just the discussion now with some of the commissioners and Dr. Hicks. There's Still some disagreement amongst the MSAB, I think, about what appropriate timelines are for evaluation. There has been a pretty clear desire expressed for having management procedures evaluated over the short term and over the long term. We're still working with the Secretariat to figure out what the best way is to provide that evaluation. The other request to note is using the coast-wide model in the interim. As folks are likely aware, many of the objectives, the fishery objectives that have been proposed, are regulatory area specific or even region specific. And it's not possible to evaluate those objectives when you're just using a coast-wide model. Everyone's aware of that, and we acknowledge the need for a more spatially explicit model. Or is that the right term, Helen, spatially explicit model? We had some discussions on terminology, but while there's a need for a model that has maybe a finer resolution, there was a request of the MSAB to continue with the coast-wide model in the interim so that we can come forward with some recommendations on scale, because scale is set at the coast-wide level. And that's the summary of our reports for 2017 sessions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaiser. Let's see if there's comments or questions. Commissioner Benken.
Just really briefly wanted to compliment you and Rachel. Adam, I know you've been chairing from the start and really appreciate the challenges you face with a really difficult topic and appreciate the time that you were putting in as well as other people on the MSAB.
Thank you, Commissioner Mencken. Actually, you remind me of the last part in my notes, which I neglected, was to acknowledge the efforts of the MSAB. I think some are aware, but maybe not all, that the board is fairly large and diverse, and they put in an incredible amount of effort. Many of the stakeholders that participate are interrupting their fishing seasons or their plans to come and sit in an office for 4 days to talk about this. For someone like myself, where all I do is go to meetings, it's not a big deal. But for many other stakeholders, it's a big change of plans, and the efforts they've put in are commendable.
Thank you very much. This says me. I'm always confused because my agenda says I'm giving this report, and so I was prepared to go over there, but please take her away.
I can do that for you. All right, good morning everybody again, and thanks to Adam for that report, and I also would like to say I really appreciate the efforts of all of the MSAB members as well. It's a really great crew to work with, and I'm really proud to be a part of that process. So this is a real brief presentation to address some outcomes of the interim meeting last November, I believe it was, just a few months ago. And a couple of recommendations and requests that came out of that interim meeting were related to the goals and objectives of the Management Strategy Advisory Board. So I've listed them here. They're in the interim meeting report, but basically they're things like the Commission agreed to provide guidance to the IPHC Secretariat on the goals and objectives at this meeting. And to note that there were some goals and objectives related to distributing the TCUI presented during that interim meeting, and we wanted to take that up here at the annual meeting, which is this presentation. And then the Commission requested that the IPHC Secretariat consolidate those objectives presented at the interim meeting into the current MSAB goals and objectives, and that's what we'll attempt to present today. And then the final number 40 there is that the commissioners would basically like to have some discussion of these goals and objectives at the interim and annual meetings, which is also why we're having this agenda item today. So many of you may be aware of this circular that was distributed on 18th of December last month, and that was presenting these commission objectives that were put forward at the interim meeting and to solicit stakeholder feedback. Just as a reminder, again, there's 6 overarching goals that were defined by the MSAB. And that ranges from biological sustainability, fishery goals, and even serving consumer needs and preserving biocomplexity. And what I'd like to talk about today is presenting to you sort of the broad description of the goals or the objectives defined by the MSAB, and then compare and insert some of the objectives defined by the Commission at the interim meeting. So in the box on the top, in the black, is our goals and objectives defined by the MSAB. And so these are related to biological sustainability here. And so, for example, those are maintain a minimum number of mature female halibut coastwide, mostly avoid low spawning stock biomass, and avoid very low spawning stock biomass. And then when the estimated biomass is in between the limit and the trigger points, to further limit probability of decline. So you want to climb out of that ramp, basically. Now, this is the measurable objective defined, and there are specifics to that. There's the outcome and the probabilities that you expect, the actual measurement or the metric that you'd be using against that, and then a performance metric that we would use to evaluate it. But this is the objective, and then you can look in our MSAB documents or actually at the very end of this presentation for more of the details. The lower box in the gold are these objectives that were presented at the interim meeting by commissioners. And so, for example, I've taken a few of those and classified those as related to biological sustainability. And those are maintaining diversity in the population across IPHC regulatory areas, preventing local depletion at the regulatory area scale, and then minimizing the impact on downstream migration area. And we have not actually further defined specifics of these objectives in terms of a performance metric, and that's something that we can do in subsequent meetings. But this is my attempt now to take the objectives listed by the Commission and classify them under the specific goals defined by MSAB and along with other objectives of MSAB. So those are the ones related to biological sustainability. Ones related to fishery sustainability and access, we have the MSAB goals defined at the top, some pretty specific measurable objectives, and then on the bottom, defined by the Commission, is maintain commercial, recreational, subsistence fishing opportunities in each IPHC regulatory area. So again, that doesn't have the specifics that are shown by the objectives defined by the MSAB, but we can definitely work on coming up with more specifics, and this is a great way to start going down the road of objectives related to distribution. Related to fishery stability, the MSAB has wanted to limit annual changes in the TCUI, and they have actually defined this by regulatory, or defined an objective to the regulatory area in this sense. And then the Commission has defined an objective, limit annual TCUI variability due to stock distribution in both time and scale. So again, more specifics on that can be developed in the future. Minimizing discard mortality, there's a couple of objectives with those. Discard mortality is less than 10% of the annual catch limits been defined by the MSAB, and the commissioners have identified minimizing discard mortality by IPHC regulatory area. The MSAB has not come up with very specific measurable objectives related to minimizing bycatch and bycatch mortality, but the Commission has identified minimizing bycatch by IPHC regulatory area as an objective. And then serving consumer needs, the same. We have not identified specific measurable objectives in the MSAB, but the Commission has identified maintain processing opportunities in each IPHC regulatory area. And so now I think you're starting to see where it's very important for us to have the stakeholder feedback when developing these objectives. And then finally, with regard to the overarching goal of preserving biocomplexity, this is something brand new in 2017 that we thought would be important to introduce, but something I realized just recently is that preserving biocomplexity may actually be an objective that we can classify under biological sustainability. We'll discuss that at the MSAB meeting in May. And so I've defined some of these preserving biocomplexity objectives presented by the commissioners under that biological sustainability overarching goal. So I think this will be moved all into biological sustainability in the future. So there were a few other concepts presented by the Commission which I really couldn't classify into any of these specific goals, these overarching goals. And those are distribution is responsive to the regulatory area abundance trends and stock characteristics. This did not seem really like a measurable objective, and maybe something that would definitely be an objective in developing a management procedure, but something I really couldn't put a measure on. So I'm classifying these things as the other Commission concepts. Distribution is responsive to management precision in each IPHC regulatory area. Again, maybe in developing a management procedure, this would be useful. And then avoiding a zero-sum distribution policy. So again, we couldn't identify a measurable component, and these may be better suited when developing the management procedure. So they're very useful in that context. And then I think maybe some further clarification from the commissioners may also be helpful for the MSAB members. So in final, some recommendations that we'd like to see from the commissioner, perhaps to endorse the current MSAB goals and objectives as a working set for evaluation of the management strategies, to agree that the commission objectives they've defined at the interim meeting fit within the overarching goals defined by the MSAB as presented here. Recommend to present commission objectives at MSAB 11. That's our MSAB meeting in May, and this is to bring forward these commission objectives that I've laid out here and were laid out at the interim meeting for further stakeholder feedback at the MSAB meeting in May. And I just want to note, too, that at this annual meeting, the conference board and the PAB have the opportunity to provide feedback on all of these objectives and goals as well. To clarify the intent of the other concepts and how they should be incorporated into the MSAB process, and then recommend that the MSAB develop measurable outcomes and performance metrics associated with those commission objectives. And for an example, you can see the performance metrics developed for MSAB objectives, which are going to be in the MSAB 10 report, as well as at the very end of this presentation, which I can show on the screen if desired. So thank you. Adam and I are available for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hicks. Let's see if there are questions. Ms. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am looking at some of the other commission concepts and trying to understand how those will be incorporated going forward. And I see ways that those could be quantified and could be part of your considerations relative to distribution, or could come in sort of later in the process. So, and I'm wondering if you need feedback from us on this point, or if it's better, and maybe this is a question to Adam and other members of the MSAB, if we give the MSAB an opportunity to take a look at that and comment on where they think those other concepts ought to be incorporated in the process before we give you our advice.
Do you mind?
So I think if there's some perspectives that the Commission will want to offer on these objectives now to clarify them so that our conversation is fruitful in May, that would be helpful. But I think what our plan is right now is we've received some guidance from the Commission. Given that it's a stakeholder-driven process, we really want to make sure that the MSAB has an opportunity to discuss these themselves when providing a consolidated set of objectives. So a bit of clarity might be helpful, but I think we really need to have a fulsome discussion in the May meeting. To Alan's point about these being other concepts, I think where at least I've started to interpret them as these are more a means objectives rather than the ends objective. So for example, the second bullet, distribution is responsive to management precision in each area. I think what that's actually trying to achieve is an objective around what the spatial distribution is. And that objective is going to be met by a procedure that is responsive to the precision. So really that's something that's probably dealt through the management procedure as the means objectives rather than an ends objective. But if we've misinterpreted it, then it'd be good to get that clarification from the Commission now. Like I said, so we'd have a fruitful conversation in May.
I guess if I could, well, I guess my thoughts at this point are I'd like to hear from stakeholders who might be here and might comment on this after we finish these reports, and then come back and give you some input on that.
Commissioner Ryall.
So there's a number of requests here, and I think first off, that Canada supports the draft goals and objectives that the MSAB has worked on, and I think that those will be useful to use for the simulations that are planned to be discussed at May. And also, I guess, I'm not sure exactly when we're going to talk about the ones that were in the IPHC circular that you had provided, Linda, but maybe it's now is appropriate time too, and I'm having a bit of a computer problem, so I can't bring them up. But nonetheless, what I was thinking is that a good place to have further discussion around those particular ones that you had proposed would be also within the MSAB, because stakeholders are there as well and could provide some more input into how those could be incorporated into the objectives that the MSAB have already developed. One thing I would like to see, though, is clear priorities set around the objectives, and like thinking about hierarchical ones that have conservation identified as a priority, for example, followed by ones that are social and economic. And it's not clear to me that that's the way they're outlined right now, but that would be, I guess, my guidance that back to the MSAB, that there be clear priority set on the objectives, and conservation being the highest one. So maybe we want to have some discussion around that to provide some guidance back.
Well, I'll start by, Commissioner Ryall said that the Canadians support the draft goals and objectives. Well, so does the United States. So I think we say the Commissioner supports the draft goals and objectives. And I think there is a, Commissioner Benkin suggested that our continued discussion of this might best be served by waiting to see what the PAG and the conference board had to say. At least I think that's what the point was. But Mr. Ryall, I think you suggested we may benefit from further discussion right here. So I'm just wondering if I got that correct.
Yeah, I guess what question I was asking, Jim, was around setting priorities within those objectives. Now, whether we do that now or after stakeholders had a chance to have a discussion among themselves and PAG and conference board and come back to report to us, that's fine too.
Well, I would think that relative to the very broad priority scheme you identified, that sustaining the population of halibut and those conservation things have a higher priority. I expect we can come to agreement on that, but let me see what the other U.S. commissioners think.
If I could,
please.
Mr. Chairman, I would certainly agree that it makes sense to prioritize conservation objectives over socioeconomic, and feel comfortable saying that at this point. I guess where I was hoping to wait for a little bit more input is relative to the broad range of objectives, how some of those objectives are incorporated going forward into the management procedures distribution process. And we have asked for some public comment at the end of these reports. We also have asked both the PAG and the conference board to take a look at where we are in the harvest policy and provide some input. So I think I'd like one more chance to circle back after we get that feedback. Chances are we will hand off a lot of next steps on that to the MSAB, but I was looking to inform the rest of our conversation on this with that feedback before the end of this meeting.
Commissioner Ryall.
That's totally reasonable. I agree.
With that agreement, then perhaps we can take the public comment from the room, and if there's anyone online. Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have a number of people here in the room who would like to comment, and the first up is Jerry Christensen.
Thank you very much, Jerry Christensen. I'm chair of the Sport Fishing Advisory Board in British Columbia. Actually, we will now call it the Recreational Fishing Advisory Board and be consistent with the IPHC. My question and comment are really prompted by Dr. Hicks's slide 23, but also by Dr. Stewart's reference earlier to what are now being termed biologically based regions. And I guess it would be helpful to have a clearer understanding of what that term means, and indeed what the biological basis of those regions is, apart from the fact that they are simply a wider geographical distribution of regulatory areas that are already there. And I ask this question because in slide 23 of Dr. Hick's presentation, it does seem to me that the way in which the term is being used is simply a perpetuation of the previous apportionment policy. That is, if you follow your organogram around, you end up dividing up the stock distribution into the old regulatory areas, albeit through a more regionalization of them, which may or not be helpful. But it strikes me that none of that comes to grips with the measurable objective, slide 5, which would take greater account of the impact of one region or one area of the coast upon another, because it doesn't seem to me that what's being proposed yet helps to deal with a situation in which two countries have to divide up the harvest between them when the system as it's being proposed here continues not to take into account either the migration, what is a coastwide migratory stock, or the fact that bycatch in one area can have a substantial impact on harvest in another area. And so I'm just worried that while I think the purpose in making these changes is good, I'm not sure that we're really moving forward in a way that is going to solve the fundamental problem. But it would be helpful to have a better understanding of what biological basis does mean.
I can provide a real brief comment if that is a question.
Dr. Hicks, did you have a brief comment and reply, did you say?
Sure. It is a move toward, I think, what you're thinking, and better accounting for the dynamics of the stock and better scientifically distributing the catch to regions, and then further considering the other considerations that you mentioned, allocation, agreements between countries, and other things like that in those distribution procedure steps. So yes, we're going to work on better definitions of all these things. In the MSAB, we're going to work on defining what preserving biocomplexity actually means, and that's going to feed back into this regional concept, hopefully, and regulatory area concept, hopefully, and exactly if a certain procedure actually will meet the objectives defined by the MSAB. So it's really the goal of the MSE is to evaluate these procedures against our objectives, and if we appropriately define the objectives, we should find the appropriate procedure.
Thank you, Mr. Christensen. And I think there's general agreement that there are issues like that, perhaps migration, perhaps bycatch that intercepts fish, but also we have spawn products that go the other direction. So we have to keep all of those in mind when we look at the proper distributions. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next speaker is Dan Falvey.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. For the record, I'm Dan Falvey with the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, and I'm just finishing up my first year as a member of the MSAB, and so my appreciation for the work that needs to be done and the scope of the undertaking has grown a lot this year, as I've said in on those meetings. And I think, reflecting back, we're making good progress on using the science to help us rough out an appropriate reference level for the scale side of the task ahead. As Alan and Adam pointed out, there's kind of two big pieces to be worked on. One is scale and one is distribution. I think there's been a lot of progress this last year on using science to rough out what a good reference level would be in terms of scale. But I also agree with some of the comments that I heard during the discussion that I'm not sure science alone is going to get us to be able to identify a good reference level on how we distribute the stock to each area. I think that's my goal, is to try and come up with reference procedures on how you would distribute it. The commission can always deviate from those for tactical reasons, but if we can find some agreement on kind of a default reference distribution approach, I think that's a good outcome. And so, because I think that just using the survey now is not necessarily, science alone is not giving us the results we want, and I think you can see that given how far the current distribution is from the baseline survey estimates are. So my goal I think the MSAB is a good forum to try and work out what are some of those other concepts that need to be mixed in with science in order to achieve a reference level that there might be agreement on. And I look forward to working on that in the coming year. And so I guess that's the value I can see adding from the MSAB to this discussion, is being able to use stakeholders and staff in kind of a detailed discussion forum to see what are some of the concepts that we would want to recommend in the commission to try and that would go into developing a reference point for distributing the stock. And I think we can get that job done or started over the next year. And so because that's where I think the potential for progress is, I think it's premature at this time to adopt stock distribution to the regional level as the default. And in fact, I was a little surprised at how much of a suggestion it was for the commission to take that step at this meeting. I think we'll have a better understanding of what some of those other considerations we might want to do and how well a regional versus an area distribution guideline would work after more deliberation through the MSAB process and your interim meeting next year. So I would recommend not making that as a final decision at this meeting. In terms of the next steps moving ahead, I appreciate the draft distribution objectives the commission developed at the interim meeting. I really appreciate the way Alan's tried to work those into the MSAB's working framework. I think the next steps are to see if there are other concepts out there that we can collect from the conference board or the PAB at this meeting, and then get the commission's reaction to those, and then work with staff in the MSAB to try and work those concepts into some type of an actionable framework that we can bring back and report to you. So those would be kind of the next steps that I see. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Falvey. Valuable comments, I believe. Thanks. Commissioner Alverson.
So Dan, I want to thank you for your participation in the MSAB and coming up. You made a comment about default distribution, and my interpretation of what you're talking about there is something other than the science and biology. And have you thought, or do you think the MSAB should discuss whether or not alternative default distributions are needed in different regions? Are they more needed in Area 2 than in Area 4, or Region 4, or Region 3? My own take is that I haven't heard a complaint from the U.S. regions based on the current science of distribution or apportionment within 3B to 3A or 4A versus 4C, D, and E. So I'm wondering if some of these matrix that the MSAB is talking about that aren't science-driven are needed to be talked about in some of the regions.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. I think I have heard issues of concern with the current way the stock is distributed in most areas. I think I heard folks from 4B saying that they were concerned about having a lower harvest rate, which affects how you distribute the overall SPR. I think I've heard folks in 3B and 3A debating whether or not they should have differential harvest rates in all of Area 3, and I think you've heard most of Area 2 kind of ask questions about whether the survey alone is the best tool. So I guess based on my discussion with other stakeholders throughout the state, I think the distribution issue does affect all areas.
Follow-up, Jim? Yeah. I guess as a commissioner, I dread socioeconomic matrix because it basically comes down to I want more in my area and it's got to come out of your area. So that's what I dread in part of this debate. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's all socioeconomics. I mean, I think there are other indices you might work in there, such as the commercial catch weight per unit effort. That's a measured value that you may use to buffer variability. There's other things like, simply taking a rolling 3-year average for the changes that, are not that are considering stability as a socioeconomic goal, but it's not necessarily directly saying I need this much for my fishery. And so when I look at those, I think there are measurable, fairly black and white indices that you can do that may address some of the distribution concerns.
Commissioner Benken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One more question for you, Dan, on the other concepts that Alan had not decided where they might go that were recommended by the commissioners from the interim meeting. Did you have any thoughts on whether more should be done to assign those at this point, or if that's a MSAB conversation?
I think that's an MSAB conversation. I think, if there's ideas around what those mean that we can clarify to understand the understanding of them, but a lot of this process has become semantics. What do you call an objective? What do you call a management procedure? How do you change a word in that sentence and it shifts it from something that's measurable to something not? And I think that level of weed killing happens at the MSAB.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
That's good.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And our next speaker is Phil Wyman.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Phil Wyman. I'm a longliner from Sitka, and I've just started to embrace the SBR way of managing things, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the old school, I guess. You could have new school, old school, but the old school way of looking at exploitable biomass. And I'm starting to really get, after coming from those Board of Fish meetings and seeing what they're doing on king salmon and bringing in scientists that are part of the treaty process there, that things are rapidly changing to the downside, and watching some of the management tools they're trying to come up with, like our fixed bycatch of king salmon in our seine fishery is a fixed amount, is probably going by the wayside, because and we're going to be kept off of any areas that there'll be king salmon interception. So, but getting back to when I first came here in 2004, we had biomass, exploitable biomass, is well over 400 billion pounds. And those two year classes we're working on now, the 98 and the 05 year classes, came from that big return. So from those big years. So as I see us the last 10 years, we've been between 200 and 200 million, 220 million exploitable biomass. And now we've just taken a notch down to 180 to 200 million exploitable biomass. I'm talking in generalities, and I think back in those days, some of the old management systems they were using, 150 million pounds triggered basically closures. So the trigger in my mind is telling me we're getting really close to some really tougher things coming in the fishery, because the 98 year class is not going to carry us for too many more years. And you got to remember that 98 year class, we fished them very heavily as 1020s back in 06, 07. So as I try to translate this threshold level of 150 million pounds, I'm starting to realize it's got to be done in an SPR formula. And so I'm trying to get there, and I know there's a number there that comes out. Maybe Alan could help me with that. So that's one of the questions, where would be at when we start having to make some really drastic measures. And the other thing I think you can look back and really the old school way of looking at things is that I'm not really for this area by area way you're looking at things, but I think we need to really start looking, and maybe they've already have, is to start looking at juvenile halibut zones where no commercial fishing is going to happen in. We did that. I don't know all the history, but I know when the stock was in terrible shape back in the early 70s, they established that no halibut fishing zone in the Bering Sea. But I think we might be reaching a point sooner rather than later that we start figuring out zones that we could actually have juvenile halibut rearing zones that there's no commercial activity in whatsoever by any of the shareholders. I'm talking bycatch, sport fish, everything. So those are my comments, and maybe you could fill in the gap about the threshold level.
I'd suggest that we take that comment and move on without responding because we have got a long way over, but it's a valuable comment. Okay, so we have, I think, 3 or 4 more people, and we would like to hear from them, so try to be as brief as you can so that we can get sort of back to schedule. Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next up is Joe Schumacher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. First of all, the comments earlier by Jerry and Dan and Commissioner Benken, for that matter, echoed my concerns on going forward with this, with the regional approach to stock distribution, and how quickly this seems to be going forward. And what I'd like to ask, we can do this on a sidebar as well, or do it at the conference board, but try to get a better definition of how we're defining these, quote, biologically significant areas, biologically distinct areas, these ecologically distinct areas, and get a better feel for that, because at this point, it seems to be a matter of convenience to some degree. So I want to see if we can better describe that as well. Also, I'd like to know a little bit more about the spatially explicit modeling that we've talked about previously within the MSAB and see where that's going forward as well.
Thank you, Mr. Schumacher. Both good points. I'm particularly interested personally in that front part, so I appreciate your comments. We'll work on those. Mr. Keith.
Next up from the floor is Dave Fraser.
Mr. Chairman, Commission members, Dave Fraser for ADEC Community Development Corporation. We're pleased that the MSAB process is underway, and we're pleased that Area 4B has been recognized as a distinct biological region in that discussion. Folks at 4B have had a long-standing concern that the policy of reducing the harvest rate by 25% was ad hoc and not well justified, and we look forward to that policy being reevaluated in this process. Yesterday, Ian presented a slide that showed a retrospective of how far offsides we have been from year to year on a coast-wide basis from the NF46 strategy. I realize that we don't have yet a spatially explicit model, but it would be informative, I think, if the sort of retrospective that Ian performed on a coast-wide basis could be performed on a regional basis to see what the actual fishing intensity has been with the TCEYs that have been adopted from year to year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. I think that might be useful as well, so appreciate that. Mr. Keith.
Next up is Douglas Daugert.
Thank you. My concerns have been addressed by others.
Thank you, Mr. Daugert. And next up after that is Clem Tillian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clem Tillian, Halibut Enterprise Corporation. Mine is just a question. Why is there a size limit on halibut? Why do we not require that every halibut capable of biting is kept? And when Ralph Ford put the 32-inch limit through, it was during the Derby days when everything was being frozen and over a short period of time, and it was trouble selling those little ping pong balls. Today, with the sashimi market and the summer flounder, they're all saleable. Why aren't we harvesting the males as well as the females? I do not object to whatever cuts are required to keep our stocks healthy, but this is just a ridiculous method of waste that we don't need. We do not need to throw them all back. Could somebody answer that one?
So Clem, Mr. Tillian, we have a special agenda item on the size limit, I believe on Wednesday, and just, Clem's a good friend of mine, but I didn't put him up to asking this question. So I also think...
the thing is, here's a chance to get my voice in, and I've been at this for quite a while. To me, it's just willful waste.
Like I said, Clem and I are good friends. I sympathize with that, but thank you very much, and we'll get to that on Wednesday at the agenda time. So, Mr. Keith, I think we have one more.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there's one question from the online audience from Jim Benton, who says, looking at slide 23, TCEY distribution, where the stock is distributed by region, is it fair to say the Commission is more conservative when setting Area 2C quotas to offset the liberal quotas distributed to Area 2B in order to fit in the distribution box?
Does anyone want to try that? What if we make a note of that and we'll get back to it. So nice observation and appreciate the comment. Thanks. So next, we're going to move directly to the agenda item 10.2, which is the Scientific Review Board report by Dr. Cox. Well, Dr. Cox is getting ready. I will note that we're a little bit behind, so we're going to probably not take a break this morning. We need to get through some of the regulatory proposals because the conference board's starting right after lunch and they'll need that information. So as necessary, please excuse yourself during the boring parts. Dr. Cox, I'm not saying it's now.
Are you referring to me?
I'm not saying it's now. I just when it gets boring.
Part, you can all go have coffee now. Well, the SRB is a bit boring. We don't get all the excitement that you guys get here at the annual meeting and everything, and that Ian and Ellen get. So this year we had two meetings, one in June and one in September. Our June meeting is typically it's the more sciencey meeting. We're talking more about research, kind of digging into the weeds on certain aspects of things that don't really come up here at the annual meeting as much. And then in September, we're basically reviewing the current state of the assessment. And the assessment this year, it's really hasn't changed. The structure of the assessment hasn't changed in a few years now, I think since about 2015. So there's really not a lot to comment on the assessment. So I just want to make a couple of points and I'll take some questions. The first one is that the SRB generally agrees with the evolution towards the SPR-based advice that's being presented. In the absence of a specific set of goals and objectives for managing the fishery, if you're going to use a biologically based one, then the SPR makes sense. As people have mentioned earlier, it reflects more of all the different aspects of mortality that are going on within halibut, from juvenile bycatch to wastage and all those other things. It takes all of that into consideration. One of the things we do note, though, that, and similar to what Alan was presenting earlier, if you're aiming for an SPR of 46%, you're likely getting an SPR that's lower than that, just because of the uncertainty in the models and those sorts of things. You tend to, and that's kind of what his graphs were showing, was that you will end up with a bit lower SPR effectively. And that's an important part of the simulations that he's going to be doing in choosing an SPR level for a target. The other one, which just came up, was minimum size limits. And so one of the recommendations that we had was to, in considering minimum size limits, whether to remove them completely or to change them to something else, is a couple of things. One is to consider an experimental approach, since size limits are going to affect fisheries in different areas differently depending on the sizes of halibut that are in that region, as well as the other kinds of fisheries that are going on, and constraints on certain fisheries that those minimum size limits will create. So in thinking about it experimentally, it'll be important to do a few things. One is to establish a process for starting an experiment and possibly ending an experiment. These sorts of experiments, they should be reversible. They should have very clear performance metrics as to what's being measured in the experiment. And they should have very clear criteria for establishing what the conclusion is based on the information that's collected. The other thing was, as part of the process for starting an experiment or to justify one, would be to make some prediction of the impact of on the fishery in a particular area before any kind of changes are made. The other, we had some discussion about it last summer about the biologically based regions, and we're looking forward to seeing exactly what some of the options are for defining biologically based regions for halibut. But one of the things to be careful about is, fish don't respect boundaries, whether we think they're biologically based or not. The ocean environment changes over time, and so anything that, any static region that's created based on habitat or something else is likely to change over time. And so that would be something that would be really important to test with a spatial model in an MSE context, would be to see how sensitive the results are to a biologically based regions in a simulation framework. The only other point I want to make is, so every year we review the different research initiatives, and we'll do that again this June. One of the things that we struggle with is, all the research looks interesting and it looks valuable in a lot of cases, and you guys are getting a lot of bang for your buck with the research that's going on. One of the things we'd like to see more of, though, is a much clearer view of how the biological and ecosystem-based research integrates with the stock assessment and how that integrates with the MSE process, just to see how all these different aspects of science research within the IPHC work together. So that's a summary of our activities over the year. I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cox. Are there questions? I have one. I guess on the size limit experiment, we need a lot of help setting it up, because in your second comment, you noted how ocean regimes change, how climate is changing, and so it probably affects migration patterns. And so I don't see how you set up a short-term experiment on a size limit change in one area that is absent all of the changing migrations, and how you draw conclusions based on that, unless it runs for like 25 years and you're talking about the Gulf of Alaska versus the Bering Sea or something. But where do you think the help to design that experiment comes from? Was it MSAB helped design that, or the Science Review Board, or where can we get information on how that might work?
I think in that case, a model is critical to that, because the duration of the experiment is completely unknown. Like I wouldn't do a 3-year experiment at all because you'd never see the implications of what that was. So yeah, you could be talking about a decades-long kind of experiment. So you would definitely want a model to inform how long that should be and what are your chances of even detecting a change. So before any contemplation of a size limit would be done, I would want to see a lot of modeling work to say what the possible scale of effect would be.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Any other questions? Commissioner Ryall.
Thanks very much for the report, Sean. You said a lot in a few minutes, and so you said that you endorse the concept of using SPR metric to manage the resources. It takes all mortality into account. You went on to say that, and this is where I wasn't quite sure what you said, that you talked about if you're targeting, and you used, I think maybe for example, an SPR of 46, that you should not be surprised if the realized SPR is lower. And I think you might have said due to model error and other things, but I'd like maybe if you could expand upon what you meant there. So that's one question. And then you commented about would like to see how the research has maybe a more stronger linkage to the management processes that are underway. And I noted that one of your recommendations is for the commission to consider hiring a life history modeler to provide more explicit linkage. And I assume that that's linked with your comment about the research. And so those are my two questions.
Okay, on the SPR one, I know the result that if you're aiming for a 46% SPR, so the reason SPR is a widely used concept in fisheries management and assessment is you don't have to know what the underlying stock recruitment relationship is to approximate what kind of an ideal spawning stock size would be. For a lot of groundfish, that's anywhere between 35 and 45% SPR would be in the range of an optimum biological production. So when we've done this in simulations, we always see that, oh, when you aim for a let's say you want to be on the aggressive side and you're aiming for a 35% SPR, invariably those come out as 30%, 28 to 32%. And the reason is when you're wrong in fisheries, you've got your point estimate, but you could be wrong on the high side, you could be wrong on the low side. So the problem is the loss, in your biological loss is different depending if you're over or under. So when you make an error where your catch is too high, for instance, then your stock you're basically taking out some of that spawning stock and it takes years to rebuild it. So the losses of the slight overfishing errors tend to cost you more than slight underfishing errors. And this tends to propagate through to give you, to maintain these lower SPRs than what your targets are. You can only learn this through simulations, the only way to do it. And that's one of the reasons why in the MSE, it's good to, like what Alan was showing with, basically, he was assuming you had a perfect assessment of the stock size every year, and it's why you have to simulate as close to your real assessment as possible to get an idea of how far off that can be. Does that clarify the first one? The second one was, I think we made a couple of hiring recommendations. We're just spending your money for you, but one of the programmer, somebody to, one of the keys about the MSE is to keep the momentum. And when you have a diverse stakeholder group, you have to be able to communicate results fairly quickly and effectively, and that probably requires a lot more time than what Alan and Ian have available. So we recommended some support there, and I think we might have recommended that before too. We recommended that from Steve Martell as well. The other was a life history modeler, and one of the things we've been learning from the biological research program is some of the different adaptations that halibut have. I mean, I can't recall all of them at the moment, but you know, there could be things like environmentally dependent sex determination, different things about when fish should migrate and when they should stay, depending on their growth rates. And those are some of the things that the biological research is trying to figure out. And you know, linking that into the MSE and into the assessment, it takes somebody with that sort of expertise. You know, that kind of life history modeling expertise, and it could really develop a much richer operating model when you're looking at. You know, what we don't want to do is build operating models that are totally predictable. You know, we want operating models that are going to challenge the assessment in a way that is kind of realistic. A lot of the things we see in fish behavior, we're always saying, well, why did they do that? And life history modelers ask those questions all the time, and they try to quantify them. And
Paul, do you have a follow-up, or is it?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. That's helpful on both accounts, dealing with the SPR. And yes, as you noted, you made a couple of recommendations on hiring, and we'll need to factor those recommendations in with others that are under consideration. So appreciate having that from the MSAB. I think you also noted, too, that I guess supporting the concept of harvest policies from other bodies that have developed objective hierarchy could be explored to see how that fit into assessments. And he went on to talk about explicitly prioritizing long-term conservation over short, medium-term catch performance. So just would note that as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Alverson.
So I'm looking at number 11 on your meeting that you had for this year. And it says the SRB noted substantial variation in survey catch rates within IPHC Regulatory Area 4B. Therefore, expansion of stations to increase coverage, and then paren 100%, is justified within IPHC Regulatory 4B to improve estimation of overall mean density. Now, we had a presentation yesterday on the expansion in that area, and it was evident that in particularly the eastern portion of 4 Bravo, that our standard survey did not have stations in that area. So is that what you're commenting on, that our standard survey may pick up some of these stations that we had in our expanded survey to better look at the density overall?
Well, I mean, increasing the sample size is going to deal with some of the, whenever you see variability in a survey, the way to I mean, that variability, occasionally you're going to get all high values, all low values, and your survey CPE will be bouncing all over the place. And the only way to deal with that is to increase your sample size, which in this case is covering areas that are within the sampling frame but not covered, and possibly to cover them all. I think that was the point there.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Benkin.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. I have a question for you on number 20. The SRB noted the plot demonstrating the minimum size limit is expected to cause an increase in total mortality, or removing the minimum size limit, I'm sorry, for both males and females, younger halibut, but a slight decrease in the older fish. And one of the concerns we hear often is that if the minimum size limit results in a high mortality on those small fish, that removing that size limit wouldn't necessarily increase the mortality on small fish. And I just wanted to get a little more insight into the conversation you had and what your discussion might have been relative to mortality on fish that are right now required to be released, but if we remove that minimum size limit, could be retained.
Well, when you retain a fish, you've got 100% mortality, and when you release it, you have a chance that the fish is going to survive. That interacts when you, in a quota fishery, when that 100% mortality of that small fish is counted against the quota, eventually you're reducing the amount of fishing effort. And that's where you get a slightly lower total mortality on older fish. And so it's that balance of reducing the fishing effort and the turnover of the small fish against guaranteed mortality of the ones you're keeping. So it's that small trade-off between those two things.
Further questions? I see none. Thank you very much, Dr. Cox.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Adjusting your schedule to fly down here, or maybe you drove here for a short time is valued by us. Thanks.
Thank you.
Dr. Wilson, where are we?
Thank you, Chair. Noting that we are behind schedule and the Conference Board and the Processor Advisory Board meetings will schedule after lunch, we'll, as you indicated, forego the break and move straight into Agenda Item 8, which is the regulatory proposals led by Steve Keith. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So what we are doing this morning is introducing the regulatory proposals which have been submitted for the Commission's consideration for 2018. And we will introduce them this morning. And as Dr. Balsiger indicated earlier, the decision-making for regulatory proposals is scheduled for Thursday afternoon, which is a bit of a change from the customary annual meeting sequence, moving those away from Friday morning and to Thursday afternoon. So that's the plan. So this year we used a new system for submission of regulatory proposals. And if you go to the next slide, please. We asked for submissions to meet the annual meeting documentation deadline of 23 December, and we received a whole bunch of them. We have 5 from the Secretariat, which I'll briefly describe. We have 3 proposals from contracting party agencies. In this case, they all happen to come from NOAA Fisheries, Alaska region, and as Dr. Balsiger mentioned earlier, because of travel being delayed, we expect to have those 3 proposals presented tomorrow. So they'll be presented to the Commission tomorrow morning, and they'll also be available to present them to both Conference Board and the Processor Advisory Board. There are also 17 proposals from other stakeholders, which we'll introduce today, and a number of those stakeholders are here to speak to their proposals, and we'll call them up as we go along. The other information that is available for the Commission's consideration as they think about regulatory proposals for this year are a series of stakeholder statements, which have been gathered into paper Info 04, as well as implementation notes that have been developed by the Secretariat staff, and that is paper number 23, where we've expressed our opinion or given additional background material on the proposals before the Commission. So let's move to the proposals from the IPHC Secretariat. There are 5 of them. The first one has to do with the IPHC closed area, which is Section 10 of the IPHC regulations. It only affects fishing in Regulatory Area 4. This, as most of you will recall, was introduced at last year's annual meeting, and at the time the Commission asked us to bring it back to this annual meeting. So here it is back with some additional documentation that we have provided. It includes the history of the closed area, why it was established, and reaching the conclusion that it no longer serves the purpose for which it was established, which is to protect juvenile halibut, as the only fishing which is excluded from the closed area is fishing by the directed Pacific halibut fishery. In our proposal, we note a series of options that the Commission may consider as they move forward with this particular proposal, recognizing that the simplest part of removing the closed area is for simply the IPHC to say that it is no longer required. Once you do that, it brings into play a whole host of other questions, namely, who's going to fish the area? And that would require close work with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council and the National Marine Fisheries Service. So recognizing that this is not a one-step operation, but probably a long series of conversations, we commend these options to the Commission's consideration as they consider removing the IPHC closed area. The second proposal submitted by the Secretariat has to do with the fishing periods. As most of you know, each year we have traditionally set, the Commission has traditionally set the fishing period starting and ending dates at the annual meeting. And so it isn't known until the annual meeting when the fishing season will begin and when it will end. And what we have proposed is that the Commission simply adopt a fixed starting and ending dates for the commercial halibut fishery. And those can be specified in a number of ways, either by a date or by a particular day of the month, of any particular month. But we recommend it to the Commission because we believe that it would aid both the staff as well as industry in planning for the fishing season as it comes up. The third proposal from the Secretariat staff has to do with the VMS requirement for Regulatory Area 4. So this only affects commercial fishing in Regulatory Area 4. And the proposal details the history of this, which is a long history. The vessel clearance regulations that are currently in place have been there since the 1960s. And they've been modified over time to account for the fact that a number of vessels have been required or have opted to use vessel monitoring systems. And now there remains an exemption for those who don't have vessel monitoring systems, VMS, to get clearances from IPHC. Our proposal proposes to do away with that and simply require that vessels require VMS for fishing in Area 4. Again, this is not simply action that can be taken by the IPHC. It will involve continued conversation with domestic management agencies about the regulations requiring VMS and how that's regulated in U.S. federal regulations. But we believe that it's no longer required. It would be much simpler in terms of administration and enforcement if all vessels fishing in Area 4 simply used VMS and didn't require clearances from IPHC. And finally, the fifth proposal from the Secretariat staff, fourth one, is minor amendments to the existing regulations. So we've proposed a number of things in there, which include clarifying the terminology, reordering the regulations for clarity and emphasis. The regulations as they exist are largely in the order that they were developed, and sometimes that doesn't quite make sense, so we proposed a reordering of some of the regulations. We propose adding a catch table, such as we traditionally display in the news releases from the annual meeting, so that the catch limits for all sectors and all regulatory areas are displayed in one table in one place in the regulations. If you probably know where the regulations for your area are, but if you're looking for all of them, you'll find that they're currently scattered throughout the regulations. We've added some clarifying, we proposed some clarifying language for the head-on requirement, which was adopted last year in recognition of the difficulty that some people had in interpreting and enforcing that requirement during this past fishing season. So we've added some words as suggested by the stakeholders to make that clearer. And we've added a few other minor things about reporting and the use of international standards. And so you'll see all of those in our proposal A4 from the Secretariat staff. And then finally, the fifth, oh, sorry, Tom, back one slide. The fifth one is a discussion paper. It's already been mentioned that this past year was the first year of the head-on requirement in all regulatory areas, and there is one exemption for that currently, which is for fish which is caught and frozen at sea. Our proposal A5 simply introduces a discussion about whether we need to retain that exemption or not. And we're not proposing that it be removed this year, but the conversation continue about whether it needs to be retained. Then moving on from the Secretariat proposals, as I mentioned, there are 3 proposals from the National Marine Fisheries Service, and we will be hearing from them on those proposals tomorrow when their staff is able to get here to Portland. And then moving on from that, there are 17 proposals from other stakeholders. I'm not going to discuss each of these. They're all in the meeting documentation and you have access to them, but we do have a number of the proponents here today who would like to speak to their proposals, and I'll call them up. And the first of those is on the next page, which will be Proposal C8, a proposal submitted by Alaska Longline Fishermen Association, and Phil Wyman is going to come and speak to that proposal. We ask that proponents limit their comments to 5 minutes or less as they discuss their proposals.
Name's Phil Wyman with our Alpha organization. So do you have that proposal to put up on the screen? I mean, the whole proposal? So anyway, talking to the proposal, we basically started this last year, and we weren't really complete with a good proposal. So what we did was we reintroduced it this year, and we captured the perimeter openings. Because of the current regulation book, it's in the old white book, the little white book. It's Regulation 19 with a 3 by it. So that basically disallows you to have any pots aboard, fishing or otherwise, shrimp pots, any kind of pots to take shellfish with. So what we've wanted, especially in Southeast, we've clarified it to a perimeter opening of not greater than 36 inches. And we basically have eliminated it. We've just basically kept it to just Alaska. But what it does is we've used the opening of perimeter opening of 36 inches, and that was derived from converting king crab pots into Pacific cod pots. And that took an opening, a normal opening of 8 inches by 36 inches. That was probably pretty good at catching halibut. And they put excluders in those pots to reduce the openings down to just, so a 36 by 8 inch pot was, they put 3 excluders in those pots to keep out all halibut. So what we have done is cater this regulation to just, being the same as what the sport fish regulations are, but this 36-inch perimeter is what's used in the state waters and the federal waters to keep halibut out of Pacific cod pots. And so our proposal is to just allow us to use pots with less perimeter, which is essentially a 9-inch by 9-inch opening. We would have pots, all our pots would be less than that size opening for catching shellfish. So this would allow us to have pots deployed while we're fishing, because a lot of our fishermen are out there with small-time families, operations, what are fishing halibut, allow us to have shrimp pots and, say, Dungeness pots in the water. So that's what our intent of our proposal is.
Thank you. Any questions from the commissioners? Thank you, Mr.
Then next up, speaking to Proposal C10 is Richard Yamada.
Good morning. My name's Richard Yamada with Alaska Charter Association. Very briefly, this proposal is to change the way halibut is measured, at least in the sport fishery. By regulation, the halibut is measured over the top, which requires a flexible ruler. And as the standard practice, or in our industry, a lot of fish is measured on board by sliding the halibut over a rigid ruler. So we'd like to, and we've had issues with enforcement. And it can vary pretty close to an inch, whether you're measuring the fish underneath or over the top. And I'm not quite sure, specifically how widespread that is in research and in the commercial fishery, but I would assume it's a lot easier to carry a rigid measuring device versus a flexible ruler that gets all slimy on a sport fishing boat. So that is a request to change the language to measuring the fish underneath instead of over. That basically is what the request is.
Commissioner, questions on that? So we may have questions from the staff later, but perhaps we'll get the presentations, and if they're really staff questions, we'll pick them, questions of us, of the staff, we'll pick those up at the end. Will that work? Okay, and so are there questions for Mr. Yamato? I see none. Mr. Keith. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next, coming up to speak to Proposal C13 are Heather McCarty, Jeff Kaufman, and excuse me if I pronounce your name wrong, Ricardo McCulloughy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I'm Heather McCarty, and I'm from Juneau, and I work with the folks at St. Paul Fish Company and CBSFA on regulatory issues having to do with halibut. With me are my colleagues, Jeff Kaufman, who is the CEO of St. Paul Fish Company and also a Bering Sea halibut skipper, and Ricardo McCulloughy, who is a Bering Sea halibut skipper as well. And we're here to address our proposal. It's under Jeff's name, and he and the rest of us are trying to address the regulations at both the North Pacific Council and the IPHC that need to be changed in order to both target halibut with pots and also to retain halibut in pots that are being used for other groundfish fisheries. And we address this at the council as well. And as you see at the bottom of the proposal that we submitted, the council action that is currently underway in that venue is explained. And we have to do it in two different places because of the way the regulations interact. And on this side of the regulatory fence, the IPHC side, we have to address the legal gear for halibut. And so our proposal attempted to include pot gear as legal gear for catching halibut, and also to address the retention of halibut in pots that are being used for sablefish fisheries. We see that in the implementation notes from the staff that they have, I think, very efficiently simplified our language and made some suggestions as to how it might be altered. And we wanted to let you know that we endorse that simplification, that proposed change from the staff. And I'll turn it over to these folks to describe a little bit more about our reasoning.
Thank you, Commissioners. As Heather mentioned, my name is Jeff, and I manage two 58-foot halibut vessels that are wholly owned by our CDQ group, the St. Paul and the St. Peter. So the purpose of this proposal is to mitigate the long-standing and detrimental losses resulting from whale depredation on longline gear in the directed halibut fisheries in areas 4A, 4B, 4C, 4D, and 4E. It is our feeling that as things change in the ocean environment and with marine mammal behavior, particularly killer whales, and the ever-increasing problem of whale depredation on longline gear, we must adapt our fishing practices for conservation of the halibut resource and efficiency. Currently, the only legal gear type for retaining halibut in the Bering Sea is hook and line gear. If this proposal is approved, it would make single and longline pot a legal gear type for directed halibut fishing in regulatory areas 4. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners, and thank you, Heather, for the introduction. Yeah, I experienced the losses that Jeff's talking about through whale, especially killer whales out on the Bering Sea edge. I ran the fishing vessel St. Paul for 5 years, and I watched the problem get worse and worse every year, you know, being followed by pods of whales for over 200 miles when you're trying to run from them, and, you know, trying to fish in areas where you know there's fish, but you can't get them because of the whales, and changes your whole fishing strategy from really trying to target halibut in areas where you know there's good fishing to running from whales, which is just very demoralizing when you're just out there trying to do your job. So I think this is a good proposal, and it'll really help, especially out on the Bering Sea edge. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
No, we're happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions from the commissioners? Commissioner Alverson.
Jeff, in the Pacific Council area, there's been a problem with whale entanglement with pots, and I think the conclusion is not quite in, but there seems to be a consensus that sinking gear at the top of from the buoy down is preferable to help avoid whale entanglement. I just bring that up because it is a horrible problem in the Pacific Council arena, and I don't want it to manifest itself in the sablefish and halibut fisheries in the Bering Sea.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner. You know, obviously we single pot for crab, for all species of crab in the Bering Sea, and I don't know what the whale entanglement issues are or the severity of those issues, but the real issue here is that the quotas have classes to them. So you have a C class or a B class or an A class quota, and the C class quota that most of our members hold is only good up to 60 feet in length. And so the problem with running longline gear is the big hydraulics that you need, and then the amount of weight from the longline gear. So we think that it's long-lining pots will work for some vessels, but a lot of these 58-foot boats that are running around chasing halibut in Area 4 are maybe too small to carry long-line gear. And under that situation, we still think it would be beneficial for those guys to be able to single pot along the edge of the Bering Sea.
So if I could ask of you a question I've asked before, but the concern that I hear is the potential for conflict between pots and longline, and that there has been a long-standing issue in some of these areas of people leaving pots on the grounds while they have their boat in the shipyard for months at a time. So I don't see in this revised language any discussion of the pot tending limits that make sure people are moving their gear or tending their gear and available to answer a call on the radio, and I just wanted to hear your comments on that.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think we understand those concerns very clearly. In Area 4C, we don't have whale depredation problems that you see along the shelf break from the Aleutian chain all the way up toward the Russian border there. And right now, trying to longline on that edge is very problematic, and that's why we saw so much of the take of Area 4D quota come out of St. Matthew this year, is because that edge is very difficult to fish. And so I don't know how much longer longlining will actually be practical on that edge as long as these whales continue to depredate. However, we do have this concern. I don't think it needs to be addressed here at the Halibut Commission, but it is certainly something that we'll take up the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council.
Other questions? Mr. Commissioner Su.
I'd like to congratulate you on coming again this year to voice the same question that you did last year. I'd like to think that this time you'll be successful in getting this show on the road, because being a fisherman myself and listening to the fishermen in BC that are having the same kinds of problems, a lot of thought and consideration goes into trying to move forward with some kind of a solution that suits you the best and where you fish and where you live. So I'd like to think that you're going to move forward with this, and I encourage you to keep working at it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Clear proposal. Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then speaking to proposals C15 and C17 is Jim Kearns.
Thank you. My name is Jim Kearns. I'm from Gustavus, Alaska. I'm with a group called Alaska Halibut Forever, and I have a charter boat business as well. But the first one I have here is an idea that was put together by a person that's on the Charter Halibut Committee for the National Marine Fisheries. Anyway, and he lives in Gustavus, but he had this great idea about a trawler halibut bycatch tender boat program. And basically what it says is this, is that and I guess it would be similar to the prohibited species donation program a little bit, kind of like that I read about. But what it basically says is that halibut that is caught by a trawler, and would therefore be called bycatch and wastage, that instead of having it go overboard or what they do with it like that, is that they would be a tender boat that would be able to pick it up, take it in, and it'd be processed. And then it would allow IFQ holders in Alaska, or if it was in Canada, to be able to use that fish, and instead of going fishing, they could have that fish that was sold, and they might get a little less money for it because it had to be processed and carried in by a tender, but then they wouldn't even have to go fishing, and they could use their IFQ and use that fish and receive the benefit from that. Now, I don't know if I explained it as clearly as I said it down here, but if you have questions, then you can go over that. But that's the basis of this one. And seemed like a great way to get rid of halibut mortality, the discard mortality that's out there in the bycatch fishery, and would just make it more, make it easy for everyone to be able to use it. And the biggest part about it is that it would leave fish that are in areas that somebody might regularly fish, would leave those fish there so they could continue to grow and develop, and then we have less, you'd have less discard wastage that would come when you have to release a fish and it might die. So anyway, it seemed like an awfully good idea, and so I wanted to present that to you so you could peruse it and consider it, and other stakeholders could have a chance to think about it and hear about it as well.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Comments? Questions? Do you have a second?
I do have a second one. Do you have any questions about that?
I heard no questions on the first one, so thank
Okay,
you. And
good. Good idea. Sounds like a great idea to me. The second one is, I don't know, I couldn't pull it up on my phone, but anyway, basically it's to have a recreational fishery allocation for Alaska. And instead of having a catch sharing program that puts the charter boat fishery or charter boat anglers into the commercial allocation, but there would be a separate allocation for commercial fishing, of course, and then a separate allocation for recreational fishing. And that would address the boom or the increase that has been recently coming up of unguided fishing, where there's quite a few people that go out and they have they don't have the same regulations that the charter boat anglers have. So it would provide for, well, if you'll hold that up just a little bit more, I can just take a look at my notes again there. So it would get rid of that unfair advantage that unguided anglers have over guided anglers, and it would control that expanding self-guided fishery, which is becoming quite a bit of an issue for people in Southeast Alaska for sure. And it would make it a little easier for the enforcement, because all recreational anglers would have the same regulations. And then I'm proposing that they would make it into a one fish any size, that you would make this, I'm recommending this, that that you would make it into a one fish, any size limit, and then as the need is for, as the science indicates, and the need is to change the amount of fish that would be taken out or that would be harvested by that group, then you put in other things like perhaps a four limit or 4 halibut a year limit for the recreational fishermen. And then the most important component, I think, is that we need to have sort of a punch card that gives us accountability in the recreational fishery, so that if you have a 4 fish limit, then you have 4 fish. And then you could even add to that for the science community. You could put down, is this a female or a male, or how long it is, or where it was caught, and you could really add to the actual accountability of the number of fish that are taken in the recreational fishery. It's an important fishery, but they're so much different than the commercial one. I don't know why that we put them together, other than it was told, you know, originally it was said that because charter boat anglers, because of the guide, they're so much more effective. But if you go out there now, you'll see that anybody can go out and find those fish, and if they don't know where to look, then they just follow the charter boat guy, and then they can get them. So anyway, I think it's an important thing to consider a recreational fishing allocation separate from the commercial fishing, and we could get rid of the CSPs and even the GAF and all those other things. So those are my comments.
Thank you for the presentation. Commissioner Benken.
Thank you. I have a quick question for you. I appreciate your comments about reporting and some kind of punch card. And I know in other parts of the country, there's a move to use apps on smartphones for recreational fisheries to report. And I wondered if that's something you're familiar with or have thought about at all.
What is that again?
Using apps on a smartphone in recreational fisheries so that there can be a more accurate reporting of catch in the recreational fishery that's also timely.
Well, in this day and age, for sure, that would be a good thing to have. I don't know any currently. I know that the fisheries management people that are at the docks, a lot of them have an iPad that they're using right now, which makes it way more easy for them to report the things and much quicker for you to receive the information. And of course, that's the name of the game, is getting that information quick enough so that we can make management decisions, for sure. I'm not sure how Canada does it, but I think Canada has a recreational allocation that's separate from their commercial allocation, and so they may have some pretty good ideas on how to manage it. But I think that we need to go that way in Alaska, and then the difference between the guided, unguided thing can go away, and because it's changing the dynamics of the fishery quite a bit. So, and as I say that, I got to tell you, I am, as far as we've talked about today, the importance of the science and the protection of the fisheries, of the resource, is so important for all of us. And for people that are in the charter business, that's key to the whole thing. And it's not so much of providing fish for people, but a recreational component. And so there might be people that would complain about a 4-year or a 4-fish annum, but I think that we're there. I think it's something that we can do. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that is the end of the presentations for the regulation proposals. As we noted, the proposals from NOAA Fisheries will be presented tomorrow to both the Commission and to the Conference Board and Processor Advisory Board, with the view to making decisions on regulations on Thursday afternoon.
Thank you very much. Are there comments on these from the commissioners for discussion now? So we know that these regulations have to work, that we adopt would have to work with Canada's regulations, United States regulations, and so I think not at this table at the moment, but I think we'll have to talk with some of our staff and make sure we have an opportunity to see that the regulations all work together. But we'll look forward to the conference board and the PEG's comments and ideas on this as well. So unless there's something else from some of the commissioners on these right now, I think we've completed what we can on these regulations this morning. And that ends the morning, I think. No. That's it? That is it. So we're going to break. The commissioners will meet and the other Captain Gray.
Thank you, everyone. So this will be the end of a public session this morning. As soon as we break from here, the hotel staff will come in and rearrange this room for the conference board's use. So we ask you to please clear out so that they can do their work. And it'll take them about an hour and a half. So the conference board expect to convene in this room about an hour and a half after we break this morning. Processor Advisory Board will be meeting in the room next door. And the commission will resume with administrative session 1 across the street in the Captain Gray room. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keith. Thanks, everyone, for the morning session.